And guys, before the video starts, I wanted to bring you news. The new channel is already live and very soon I will be bringing you even more content. So click on this link in the description and in the pinned comment and the manhwa channel will start booming. And if you like the recaps I do here, you'll like it twice as there will be even more content there. So give it a boost and let's hit 1,000 subscribers there before I forget. The times are in the description, don't forget to skip for the new EP or watch one you missed, and without further ado, let's get into this insane anime. The anime begins with a fierce fight, which takes place under a full red moon. Several goblins attack a boy armed with only his sword, and after killing everyone with ease, the boy cries out for more enemies, and well, the scene cuts to a rural worker, who follows his route calmly, until he comes across a horde of goblins. The man begs for help, and is soon saved by two warriors who came on horseback, and one of them says that when a goblin emerges, there will certainly be a few hundred more of them around. And as the fight develops, other warriors appear to help them in the fight, and after that, they return to the castle, and the tallest warrior of all comments that he reached level 6 after their fight against the goblins. And besides, everyone managed to save a lot of money from this fight, and they go ahead to get their reward, when they are observed by a boy, who shows repulsion in this goblin hunt that they are doing. And then his stomach starts growling, and he explains that this is thanks to a useless skill he has, which in this case would be the skill of gluttony, but he is relieved to at least have a job. And when sunset arrives, the city is visited by the 3 holy knights, and everyone stops at the same moment to watch them walking around the place, and one of the warriors says that they are the trio of Vlaric brothers. And at a certain point, one of the trader's oranges rolls to Hato's feet, and he goes there to apologize at the same time, but the knight doesn't take it kindly, and kicks the man, leaving him on the ground. The merchant then tries to justify himself, but Hato understands that as his attempt to impose himself on his whims, so K1LL goes to him and says that the merchant should be aware of the risk he runs when debating with one of them. In this case, he would have his head cut off if he bothered them, and upon hearing this, the merchant begs even more for mercy, and then the two are restrained by the other holy knight, who appears to have more sense. He tells the merchant that he will forgive his actions just that once, and Hato reveals that he was lucky to continue living, and after they leave, the man is welcomed by one of the residents, who is outraged by the scene they witnessed. And then the warriors also comment on what happened, and one of them is outraged that they are holy knights just like Roxy. Well, again we go back to the boy with gluttony, and his stomach growls as always. Yeah, what a useless skill. He is then surprised by the holy knights, who call him Fate, and so we discover the Sweet Tooth's name. The knights question him if the boy would have done a good job in their place. And Fate replies to Raffaele that yes, and then the knight throws some coins on the ground, and says that it is his payment for the good work he did, and he asks Fate to take the money, in a humiliating tone. And when the boy bends down to pick up the coins, Hato goes up to him and steps on his hand, saying that she didn't notice him, because of his dirty and insignificant presence, and then Fate's stomach growls again. And this makes Raffaele angry. After all, it doesn't even seem like they give him food like that, and Hato kicks him again while asking if the boy is trying to embarrass the Vlaric family. And Fate reflects that in this world there are people who have things, and on the other hand there are people who have nothing, which is his case, and while he is being kicked, K1LL goes to him, and disdains his lack of useful skills, and says he only manages to make money thanks to the piety of holy knights like them. And for her, Fate should be grateful for that everything, and the boy finishes his reasoning, reflecting that what differentiates him from people who own things are the special powers given by the gods, that is, skills. And well, Hato explains that when he doesn't do the job right, it tarnishes the image of the contractors, which in this case would be them, and so he orders him to get up, so that he can continue to provide his good service. But Fate was too hurt to stand, and Hato goes to him and steps on his face, telling him to get up quickly, so seeing that he wouldn't obey, Raffaele suggests that he have some punishment, as disobedient dogs need to be disciplined. However, they are interrupted by Roxy, who says that they promised protection to the citizens, therefore that abusive practice was unacceptable from them, but the knights look at her with a look of opposition to her ideas. However, she continues to explain that the gate is the honorable duty of the holy knights, and they are failing her when they hit a citizen in front of her, but Raffaele tries to explain himself, saying that it is also the duty of the knights to provide employment for those who need. But Roxy still disagrees with the treatment they give to their employees, but Raffaele says that they just have a difference of professional opinion. Yes, the guy brought that up. And well, they ask Roxy's permission and continue on their way, whereupon the girl goes to Fate, and extends her hand to the boy, asking if he is okay. He says yes, but when looking at Raffaele, Fate notices that the knight is very angry with him. And Roxy asks Fate to be quiet, so she can clean the bleeding from his face, and he in turn thanks her for her help and kindness, but Roxy says that they are fellow gate guardians. Besides, she is a holy knight, therefore you would only be doing your obligation to help him. And then Roxy says it's time for them to change shifts now, and the boy passes the flag to her, and the girl looks at him seriously, and tells Fate to contact her in case the other holy knights beat him again. And he says he will do that, but also reveals that he is used to being treated that way, so the boy excuses himself and leaves, but Roxy is still thoughtful about what she saw. And well, after leaving, the boy stops to think about what he heard from her, and even though Roxy promised him protection, Fate still remembers Raffaele's wicked look, and although she knows all the evil of him and his gang, Fate he still doesn't know what they would be capable of doing. So he thinks he shouldn't involve Roxy in this, to avoid her suffering any consequences. Well, the store owner goes to the boy, and asks if the knights hit him again, but Fate remains silent. And the man says that if things continue like this, the boy will end up dead, just like another guy the knights killed, but Fate just pays for the meal and thanks him by leaving, so the man promises to pray for him to be okay. And on the way back, Fate goes back to lamenting about his useless and boring gluttony. That's right, the guy just ate and his stomach is already full, and well, the boy says he wishes he had been born with some ability of more value. And I wouldn't need to be a holy knight, for Fate to be a warrior, or even a merchant, would be enough. However, the boy knows that there is no way to change things, and as he continues on his way, the boy notices several suspicious silhouettes, and deduces that they would be thieves. In that, Fate hurries to warn Roxy of what he saw. And upon learning what happened, she hurries to arrest the bandits, and then leaves him responsible for taking care of the gate in her absence. And after hearing the sounds of combat, a silence appears, and Fate imagines that everything was over. However, he notices a strange man running towards the exit of the gate, and the boy turns to flee, but it soon comes to his mind that Roxy entrusted him with that role, so it would be a dishonor if he disappointed her. And then, Fate puts himself on guard, to stop the man from passing him, and upon analyzing him better, he notices that the man is already injured, and that gives him the advantage. Fate then attacks the man with the spear, and soon realizes that his gluttony ability has been activated, increasing his status, and this has given him two new abilities, identification and telepathy. Well, he is confused about that, and then Roxy finally returns, and when she looks at him, she notices that there is something wrong with him, and mentally she shows concern for him, so Fate can hear the girl's inner voice, and this is strange, but he says he's fine. And then Roxy celebrates internally, and Fate is able to hear her voice again, even though she didn't express it in words, and Roxy says that she will report everything that happened with the thieves to her superiors. And upon hearing her, he realizes that the inner voice has disappeared, and again he is confused about what he heard before. She then draws his attention, and Fate says that she could take credit for the entire feat. But the girl explains that he killed one of the bandits, but he says that if Raffaele finds out what he did, it could cause problems for her. But the girl understands that Fate would be worrying about not causing problems for him. And well, she says she understands his point of view, but says that without him, she might have failed in her duty to protect the gate. And then Roxy says she needs to repay him somehow, and asks him to work for his family, but he is scared by the proposal. And she asks if Fate would like to work until death for the Vlerix family, so the boy begins to reflect that he will be treated like dirt forever if he continues working for this family. But if he accepts her proposal, he will be able to work alongside Roxy and with dignity. However, he wonders who will take his place if he leaves his post, and she says that it is a holy knight's duty to protect the gate, so he shouldn't worry about it. And Fate deduces that if she's the one saying that, then it must be true, and so he accepts the girl's offer. And well, after that Fate goes back to looking at his stats, and finds it strange that he's in triple digits now. Furthermore, Fate still doesn't seem to understand the identify and telepathy skills. But when he remembers what he heard when talking to Roxy at that moment, he understands that that inner voice was the telepathy skill. And then the boy looks at his hands in fright, and wonders what happened to his body. But in addition to finding these abilities strange, Fate also sees them as good weapons in the fight against monsters. And the next day, he goes to a sword stand, and the merchant asks what the budget is for the weapon he is looking for, but when showing his money, the man notices that the boy is poor, and says that he doesn't have enough money to buy any weapon. Then Fate is disappointed, because in the 5 years he arrived at the place, those 2 silver coins were all he managed to collect, so the merchant tells him that Fate would only be able to buy the worst swords in the stall with that money, and he points out for a barrel. And the boy goes there, and thinks he should get one, that's better than nothing, and when he gets the sword, he activates the identify ability, and notices that the sword's durability and strength are at 0. So he analyzes the others, and they are also bad, until he finds a sword that catches his attention, as it is a little dirty and is treated like trash by the merchant, and soon he identifies with that same situation. And well, the sword suddenly speaks to him, and Fate is scared, so the boy pays attention to it again, and again hears a voice, which says that Fate will not regret buying it, and in addition to talking to him, the sword demonstrates knowledge of his gluttony ability. Then Fate questions how he knows this, and the sword replies that it's because they have a lot in common, and so the boy buys it, and well, K1LL comments to the other knights about the rumor that Fate is being hired by the Hart family. And the girl shows a lot of anger at this, and says that they should punish Roxy for trying to do that without asking them first, but Raffaele responds that they could easily replace Fate, so they shouldn't bother thinking about it. However, she says that Roxy was affronting them about their customs in handling their guard duty, but he explains that the Harts and Vleriks are part of the 5 families that support the kingdom, so they still wouldn't have plausible reasons to cause anything discord between them. And Raffaele then gets up and says he's going to the military district again, and K1LL questions what he's studying, as the guy is more excited than usual. And he replies that he is researching immortality, but the girl just laughs in his face, thinking that Raffaele was joking. Well, Fate goes to a deserted area with his sword, and she says that she did the favor of memorizing his name. So Fate is confused about this, but he is soon warned that enemies are coming towards him, and the boy kills the first of them, thus causing his gluttony ability to be activated, and in addition, he had a strength increasing ability. And after killing the first goblin, the sword talks about that famous saying, where it said that where there is one goblin, there are hundreds around, and in fact several of them appear, and attack Fate. He then continues killing everyone, activating his gluttony ability more and more, and when everyone is on the ground, he looks at his status again, and notices that he has gained more abilities, so the sword comments to Fate that he must be feeling better. Feeling full now. And he realizes that he really isn't hungry. He notices that his stomach didn't growl once during the fight, something that had never happened before, but Fate tells the sword that he thought people were born with predetermined abilities. However, the sword responds that he is different, and the healing ability is responsible for this. He explains that normally stats increase in battles, and based on your experience, your level rises. However, his gluttony ability steals status and skills, but the cost of this is that he does not acquire experience, and in this Fate understands why he has been at level 1 for a long time. He then questions the sword as to how it knows everything. That one. And the sword's answer is that they are equal, and that's why he knows all that, and the sword adds that his ability should be kept secret, as it would be better for him. After all, this is an ability that defies divine laws, which Fate is amazed at, and decides that the best thing he can do is fight alone, but the sword says that now he is no longer alone, because Fate has him by his side. Then the boy asks if the sword really accepts him as master, and he says yes, but tells him not to think too much of himself, and well, Fate decides that he should leave for that day, but the sword tells him to take Fate's ears. Goblins he left behind. So he will be able to make money by selling them, and so he does, and the result of his sales were 3 silver coins and 80 bronze coins, and he soon gets excited to buy meat with the money, but the sword warns him that needs maintenance, after all they were in combat. Then Fate says that his new friend is very bossy, and the sword says that it's not called greed for nothing, and well, he continues on his way, and ends up bumping into a man, who tells him to watch where he's going. But besides him, the guy was accompanied by a child who was asking for help internally, and Fate was able to hear her with his telepathy ability, and the man pulled the girl away. Then he uses his identify to analyze his target's abilities, but the sword notices that the man uses the ability to hide, and this leaves his abilities hidden even for Fate's identify. And taking this disadvantage into consideration, the sword questions what he will do now, and Fate says he will not ignore that, so he runs to the man, and in the meantime, he ties the girl in his captivity, and says she will be a toy of the Holy Knights. And Fate is right behind listening to everything, and then the sword warns him that there is still a way to return, and says that the guy is very tough, but the boy feels that he must help the people who suffer around him, especially now that he has power. For that, the beginning of the episode, in a convent, a sister says that Saint Laplace is the creator of this world, and when she left the world she created, she left behind special powers, which they call skills. And so, she asks everyone to give thanks to Laplace while giving thanks for the food they are enjoying today, but one of the children doesn't seem to be eating, and is still down. And the nun comes close to him, asking what he has, and in this the boy says that Saint Laplace plays dirty. He gave the Holy Knights incredible abilities, while for him, the saint gave a ridiculously weak ability. And he thinks this is because they abandoned him, but the nun explains that in the old days, when Laplace defended the world, there were no skills or statistics. And she says that at that time, everyone was equal, and the boy soon wishes that he had been born in that time of skills communism, but the nun is sad, hugging him, but then, another sister appears. She says that even though they looked, they couldn't find her, and the sister who was already there notices that the girl who should have been in that place on the table is still missing, and she calls her Sarah with a sad look on her face. And in another corner of the city, this girl is trapped among boxes, tied up. Meanwhile, her kidnapper is threatening her with psychological terror, wanting her to keep crying. And he asks the little girl to scream more. To satisfy the guy's sadism, he continues telling her that the girl will become a toy for the holy knights, and even though the girl is silent, he still thinks she would be a hassle. And leaves there, leaving her crying. But in the midst of her despair, our starving hero arrives, and he tells her that now things will be fine. She then falls next to him, and Fate gets on the bed to leave, until the man comes back. However, when looking behind Fate, the girl is scared, because there was her kidnapper, returning from where he had gone, and he tells Fate that he has a very idiotic sense of justice. But he is not shaken by the guy's offense, and puts himself in a combat position, so the kidnapper feels that things are going to start to get interesting, and Fate thinks to himself that he needs to take the girl to a safe place, but he still doesn't know where. And well, his sword says that that kidnapper feels stronger than Fate, and that would be good for him, as he could take advantage of his enemy's overconfidence, and so the sword tells him to turn back. And Fate runs with the girl, but the man goes after them both with his machete, and tells him that if he kills him in front of the girl, she will fear him even more. Well, after taking cover, the sword gives the command for him to knock down those boxes, to catch him off guard, and so Fate manages to stun him with one blow, and moves him away. At this the man gets upset, and proposes that they settle their differences soon, and then his sword starts to shine, and Fate's sword says that it is a sharp blade, and that would be a big problem for them. And then he tells Fate to hit the enemy with the weapon, but he was already quick about that, and goes up, destroying the kidnapper's sword and piercing him. And well, Fate says that he heard the man talking about the holy knights, as if one of them was interested in satisfying himself with the girl, and then he questions which of them sent him to kidnap her. But the man says he won't turn anyone in, and this makes Fate even angrier, and then he pierces him once more, and asks again who would have hired him, to which he decides to open his mouth and says that he was under Hadovlaric's orders. Then Fate gets scared, but in the end, everything worked out and he leaves with the girl safely. And when he hears the girl's stomach growling, he readily offers to take her to eat, but before that, Fate asks her name. And the girl says her name is Sahara, and well, he says that her uncle will buy her something to eat. They then buy barbecue skewers. Then Sahara reveals that this is the first time she has eaten meat. And upon noticing that she really liked it, Fate decides to give her kebab to her too, and after that, he takes her back to the convent, and the sister hugs the girl, relieved that she has returned safely. They then thank him, and this leaves him a little disconcerted, because that was the first time someone had thanked him for something, and he tells them that their skill is bad. Then Sahara shows interest in knowing more about this, and Fate explains that it consists of making him hungry, but he goes to her and says that regardless of the difficulties, she should keep smiling, because that way happiness will inevitably come. And she wonders if this would apply to her too, so when he hears this, Fate remembers that he is giving the same advice he received from his father when he was the girl's age. His father told him that he should keep laughing at things, so that true happiness would come, and when the child Fate hears this, he asks himself the same question as Sahara. He wonders if this applies to him too. And well, at that time he hadn't understood those words, but thanks to them, Fate says he managed to get to where he was, and that's why he wants Sahara to survive too. And after that, he continues on his way, and his sword says that he now has technical ability too, so Fate questions whether this would be a good or bad thing. And he answers yes, because with these technical skills it allows him to have secret arts and techniques, and in these cases he could attack twice in the same time as one, leaving him at an advantage. Then Fate questions whether this was the sharp blade he had said previously, but before hearing the answer, he reflects a little and realizes that if the kidnapper had used this technique on him, Fate would probably no longer be alive. And the sword says that he just didn't warn him before because he was seeing a hero trying to save a young girl, and it would be horrible to interrupt that moment, but Fate says that he's not a hero at all, and says that if he had known about the mortality of this technique, he wouldn't have reacted. Risky. Then the sword says that he doesn't need to be ashamed just because he did something atypical, and explains that the strongest doesn't always win a fight, so Fate asks if his winning was luck. And he says that if that is the case, he will need to train to become stronger, and thus win fights without depending on luck, and well, the sword interrupts him to ask him an important question. He wonders if Fate will go to her first day of work at the Hart family wearing those old clothes. He then realizes that he forgot to buy new clothes and becomes desperate. And in another corner of the city, a man comments that Mason was defeated by a divine dragon in Gallia, and as it was a warrior friend who told him this, he confirms that the story happened. Then the other man questions what the Hat family will be like, and then he says that Roxy will be the successor, but he shows concern about how control over the knights will be, as he is the one who kept them in line. And for you, Roxy won't make it keep the knights in order. In this the other man immediately understands which knights you are talking about, in this case it would be the Vlaric brothers, and says that it will really be unpleasant if these brothers are not controlled. Well, the man asks how Fate is, and the man says that he usually comes to his establishments every day after work, so the scene cuts to the next day, and Fate is walking through the Holy Knights district, and is amazed with the size of the place. Then Roxy appears, showing happiness that he actually went there, but she soon realizes that he is staring at her a lot, and Fate, and says that she looks very beautiful, so that's why she ended up being speechless. Then Roxy blushes too, and says that it's good to wear a dress sometimes, so as not to lose your femininity, and well, she takes him to a tomb, whereupon the girl tells her deceased father that that boy is Fate, and says that he will work there from that day onwards. And upon hearing this, he wonders if that would be her father, and Roxy says yes, and explains that 5 days ago he encountered a divine dragon and died. Then Fate remembers that Gallia is a continent dominated by creatures, and the Holy Knight's duty is to contain them. And Roxy explains that that year it was the Hart family's turn to face them, and although it was a dangerous task, she believed it was not a deadly task, but a divine dragon that lived in her lair, decided to show up after 1,000 years without appearing. And so, her father's entire army ended up going after Vasco, so Fate admires her, because even though she was in a situation like that, Roxy showed concern for him, and this makes him frustrated with himself because he didn't realize it before. And Roxy notices his guilty face, and tells him to get it together, because now her family already has a new leader, which in this case is herself, and for the girl, that family must be lively, so she asks to count on him for that. And Faye smiles again, saying that she has his support, so she reaches out to him, but he is afraid to touch her, because if he does, the telepathy will activate. And then a woman appears just in time, and Roxy introduces her to him. Her name would be Haru, the housekeeper of the Hart family, and the girl looks at him seriously, telling the boy to behave appropriately, like a good servant of the Harts. It must be. He then shows all his etiquette, tasting meat like an animal, leaving Haru in despair, and well, after the meal, Fate goes to take care of the garden, where 2 workers tell him not to overdo the work. And then the men comment that it's been a week since Fate started working there, and one of them says that at first he thought he was just a weirdo who talked with a sword, besides always eating meat while shaking all over. And Fate asks the men to go easy on him. After all, it had been more than 5 years since he ate meat, so his stomach started to growl soon after eating, but Fate gave the excuse that he was growing. Well, Haru suddenly appears, and says that Roxy is calling him, and when he gets there, she asks if he has gotten used to the job yet, but he was in the moon world, and the only thing he thinks is that he was getting increasingly greedy. Then Roxy catches his attention again, calling him Faye, and asks what's happening to him, and Fate just says that she remembered his father, because he calls him that too. And Fate explains that she ended up losing him in a monster hunt, in the same way that Roxy's father died, and he questions why she called him Faye. Then Roxy explains that this is a nickname for Fate, and she says she's giving him pet names to liven up the house, just like she said she would. After all, he's practically family now. And upon hearing this, the boy is amazed, because he and Roxy being a family is something he didn't imagine possible, so he asks to be called just Fate, but she refuses. And then suddenly the guy starts to have blurred vision and blacks out, and when he wakes up, he is in his room, and on the table there is a letter from Roxy, where she asks him to rest the next day. And well, he asks his sword what is happening to him lately, as he has never been this bad, so the sword responds that from the moment gluttony tastes the souls, she can no longer stop. For with each new soul devoured by her, gluttony grows stronger, so Fate is doomed to habituate souls until the day of his death, and he questions what will happen if he doesn't feed gluttony with more souls. And the sword responds that he will starve and die, or in the worst case scenario, he will become controlled and attack anyone who gets in his way. And upon hearing this, Fate is shocked, because this is the definition of a monster, and the sword gives him a tip. It says that when his hunger is at its limit, this will be visible in his eyes. And he reinforces what he said previously, about the die having already been cast on him, and from now on there is no going back. Well, he leaves his room, and when looking at the people around, Fate says that they have an appetizing way. And the sword explains that this is because he has increased gluttony, and Faye questions if this also explains the red eyes, so the sword says yes, and explains that the increased gluttony is a temporary power, which allows the use most effective of the gluttony skill. In other words, it has more accurate night vision and can hunt prey by its scent. In addition, weaker prey will be paralyzed by the murderous aura it will have. Well, he goes to the goblins, and notices that they are really just standing around, so Fate starts killing them one by one, but he still doesn't think it's enough, so the sword suggests that he go to the hobgoblin forest then. And so he does, but after killing many of them, Fate wonders how many souls he still needs to get rid of that hunger, and well, when he finishes, he feels exhausted, and says he wishes to never feel that again. And the sword says that if he wants to stay in control, Fate must go hunting for souls regularly, and then out of nowhere a giant monster appears, and he is informed by the sword that it is the Goblin King. And he also informs that Fate has acquired health regeneration, a healing ability, so he can continue fighting even when injured. So Fate begins to approach the monster, but shows fear. There the sword explains that humans are not feasts for monsters, therefore he is safe, but still, he is advised to proceed cautiously. Well, he waits for the right moment and attacks him, and when he lands, the Goblin King tries to attack him too, so Fate starts to just dodge the attacks, and the sword tells him to attack too, as he couldn't defeat him if he just stayed dodging. So Fate trusts his friend's words and goes after the monster, and thus defeats it. Then his gluttony ability is activated, and the sword says that with his status now, Fate can access the first level of his sword. In this case, this is her other form, and he explains that if Faye gives his status to the sword as an offering, it will be able to provide new functions, and this sparks his interest. But the sword explains that to activate this form, Fate must hand over all of her status since when they first met, after all, the sword's name is Greed. So he gives up on this idea, because that would be too much, but the sword says that if he doesn't do that, he loses the right to use it, because either he becomes strong alone, or he contributes to the evolution of the sword too, so that the two of them stay strong and continue walking together. And so the sword gives these two choices to Fate, but it doesn't take him long to choose. After all, Greed is his only partner, so when he offers his statuses, he is able to feel the strength eradicate from his body, as if she were being robbed. And well, Greed's new form is a magical bow, and the sword reveals to Fate that there has been someone watching them for a while, and this was happening at a good time, as he could test his new sword on this enemy. Then Faye asks where she could get the arrows, but the sword explains that they appear magically, he just has to pull the bow. Besides, Fate can aim anyway, and the arrow will hit its target the same way. And then he does the test, and hits the enemy, and well, as he looks back he notices the Goblin King's ears there, and says that this will be able to feed them for a while. Roxy walks towards the gate, until Fate goes to her, as he didn't recognize her, but she ends up getting scared, and he says he didn't recognize her because of her different clothes. And he questions whether she will go to the castle dressed like that, and well, as he had already seen her, Roxy goes to his ear and reveals the truth. In this case she was leaving for a secret inspection of the city, and for that she needed that disguise, and she asks him not to tell anyone, as it would be a problem if it reached Haru's ears. After all, she would complain about her clothes, because they weren't appropriate for the head of the Hart family, and well, he understands the situation and apologizes for taking up her time. And when Fate was about to return to work, Roxy pulls him away, saying that she had a great idea. She says that she will give him a confidential mission. In this case, he would accompany her on her inspection, acting as an escort. And then they leave, and the girl appears to be in a hurry with the trip, and he asks her to calm down, but he calls her by her name, and the sword warns him not to call her Roxy, because the people around her could find out. And then she goes to him and puts her finger in his mouth, and asks Fate not to call her by her name there, and the sword whispers to Fate, saying that he had warned her. But he tells him to shut up, and she thinks it was meant for her, but he dismisses it, saying he didn't say anything, and well, she has the idea of him calling her Rocky, and says that will be his new name for today. Then the sword makes another comment, and Fate tells her to shut up again, and Roxy, upon hearing that again, feels that she was being very annoying that day, and again he tries to talk away. However, she says that he told her to shut up, but Fate says that she wasn't being annoying, and Roxy says that she was just excited about the idea of them going out together, and then the sword lets out a sigh, as if to say that, the love is in the air. And upon hearing this lack of respect, Fate violently catches him, and Roxy stops him, saying that she will not allow him to treat his weapon with that disrespect, which he apologizes for. And she says she's never noticed Fate's sword before, and so he thinks Roxy might find it strange that he has a bad skill, and yet has a sword. And with that comes his real nature in his mind, where he needs to always be feeding his gluttony with souls, because if he doesn't do this, he will become hungry and end up dead, or in the worst case scenario, Fate will lose control over the world, your body, and will attack everyone around you. And precisely for this reason, he feels that he should not let Roxy know about his gluttony ability, and well, when analyzing his sword, Roxy advises him to take better care of it, and says that later she will take him to his blacksmith's shop. Family. And this makes him happy. After all, his sword will receive maintenance after a long time, but when he tries to talk to the greedy man, he tells him to shut up too, as he is enjoying that moment, and says that Roxy has a pleasant smell. And well, when she arrives in the city center, she goes to a fair to look at the grapes, and the stallholder says that those are fresh grapes, taken from the Hart family vineyards, and she asks to try them. And in that Fate praises those fruits, she says that they were created in her home, and that's why they are very good. But upon hearing this, the market vendor becomes suspicious, and Fate feels that he would end up discovering Roxy's real identity. But greed gives him the idea to say that the girl is related to the Hart family, in which he saves her from trouble, as the stallholder buys the idea straight away, and the girl says he was incredible. However, greed tells him that Fate owes him one, and he goes back to talking to his sword, to which Roxy says that he is a bit strange. Well, one of the residents warns that the holy knights are coming, and they are left wondering what would they be doing there. And one of the residents comments that since Mason's death, even the most inferior of knights was becoming increasingly unbearable. After all, there was no one left to clip his wings. And this inferior knight hears Fate's stomach growl, and his sword grumbles, saying that this was not a good time for that, and Fate tells Greed to shut up, but the knight understands that it was for him. And he goes to the boy, and then he kneels and apologizes, but the knight is not satisfied, and tells him to speak louder, but Roxy intervenes, and says that Fate has already apologized, so he turns to the girl and the girl calls it reckless, because he is responding to a holy knight. And well, when he takes a closer look at her face, he feels like he's seen her somewhere, and some civilians around say that she looks like Roxy, and everyone is confused by that. Until Greed comes up with the idea of pretending to be her clingy boyfriend, because if he does that no one will suspect her, but Fate is surprised to hear this idea, and Roxy ends up listening to him, and thinks the idea is very good. And then they start arguing like a normal couple, and she tells him to have breakfast before leaving the house, to avoid situations like this. And she turns to the holy knight and says that she will make sure her boyfriend eats better when they leave the house, and with that they continue moving forward, and the civilians comment that that girl really couldn't be Roxy. Well, they hide from the crowd, and in Roxy's mind she feels distressed by all that. After all, she had never held a man's arm before, and that would be making her heart race, and Fate hears everything with her ability of telepathy, and lets go of her arm, apologizing for that. But the girl says it's okay, as she was already used to his arm, so she just continues on her way, as if nothing had happened, and once again the sword makes that basic joke, shipping them both. And Fate comments that escorting Roxy could be a big problem for him, and well, he goes to her, and notices the girl looking at some jewelry, and she says that she also likes it. After all, Roxy is a normal girl, like all the others. Well, she points to an ore, and asks if that would also be jewels, and the merchant explains that those ores may contain jewels, but they may not, and to find out, just open them. And he says that each of the ores are 10 bronze coins, and asks if Roxy would like to test her luck, and Greed explains that if Fate uses his identify ability, he will be able to find the jewel the first time. And then he begins to analyze each of the stones, and his sword warns him not to let his skill be revealed, as traders hate people who have identify. Well, he turns his sights to Roxy, and as he looks at her, Fate notices that she doesn't look like a holy knight from an important family. In his eyes she sounds like a normal girl. And upon noticing the boy's eyes, the merchant deduces that Roxy would be his girlfriend, and says he will give him a discount if he wants to give his girlfriend a gift. But upon hearing this he turns all red, and as usual, Greed teases him. He couldn't let this opportunity pass, and well, the girl leaves the jewelry in place again, and says she won't buy it, because these jewels will be of no use to her. Then she follows the path, and Fate asks if she really doesn't want the jewels, and she says yes, and changes the subject, asking if Fate knows any warriors. And he responds that he knows Oliver and Minerva, but Roxy asks for the names of active warriors, as they were already retired, but before he responds, the two are distracted by two men, who are talking about goblins that had been killed. And one of them says that there are rumors that they were killed by a monster that roams around, and Fate is surprised that the citizens think that about him, and the men say that this story is badly told, because an orphanage in the favela received the ears of the Goblin King, therefore it would not be a monster responsible for the deaths of the goblins. And the other man comments that the nuns are looking for the donor, and well, Roxy shows interest in this matter and goes to the men to ask for more information about this supposed monster. However, they say they don't know much about him, and advise her to go and ask the warriors, so she asks Fate to take her to where there are warriors, and then he questions whether the purpose of her inspection would be to carry out that investigation. And she states that yes, Roxy is investigating the monster of these rumors. He is speechless. After all, the monster is himself. Well, after that Fate goes to the bar he used to go to, and the owner is impressed by his visit, as he believed Fate to be dead. And then he introduces Roxy as Rocky, and says that she is a colleague from his new job, and the owner says he hopes she takes good care of Fate, and also makes a joke, saying that he has evolved a lot since last time that they saw each other, after all he was even dating. However, he becomes embarrassed again and says that she is not his girlfriend, and then Fate begins to wonder if Roxy is not angry about this, as she is treated like his girlfriend all the time. And in this she also loses control and ends up breaking the glass by accident, but the owner understands and says that there are not many warriors capable of controlling their status. And after Greed suggests that Roxy was very comfortable with him, Fate also gets emotional and breaks the glass, and well, the owner comments about the warrior who made a lot of profit from goblin corpses. And he explains that the guy found the goblins with their ears still intact, but Roxy explains that this being was not looking for a reward when doing this, and so she suggests that it really is a monster that is behind these deaths. And then the bar owner says that he will be a problem for the city's business, and Fate asks why, and he explains that people will be afraid to go hunting, as they will have to pass through the goblin plain, where a mysterious creature resides. And for fear of death, people will avoid doing this, and Fate regrets being responsible for all this. Well, Old Ad appears in the conversation, and says that the most widespread theory among people is that the monster that vacancy out there would be a lich. And because it is an extraordinary threat, you explain that the Holy Knights are preparing to act against this creature as soon as possible, and upon hearing this, Fate gets scared, and Greed says that with Fate's current status, you won't be able to face these enemies. And well, you question why Roxy wanting to know so much about this monster, and Fate just doesn't know what to do, because if she joins him on his hunt, the girl will discover that he is the real monster. Then some warriors appear in the bar, and one of them goes to Roxy, and asks her to sit with them, and then Fate tries to intervene, but she sends the warrior away alone, and the gentleman is incredulous at such strength, and says that only a holy warrior would be able to do that. And well, everyone notices that it was actually Roxy, and she apologizes for having deceived everyone, so the men who were playing on her side apologize and beg the girl not to kill them. However, she says that it is sad to see that the people that her family is supposed to protect, fear them like that, and Roxy says that she feels embarrassed about it all. After all, for her, the Holy Knights are supposed to protect the people, and laughs alongside of his subjects. Because this was her father's dream, therefore it is also her dream, and upon hearing this, Fate thinks to herself that she will follow Roxy until her dream comes true. Well, the next day they go to the Hart family's blacksmith to do Greed's maintenance, and he feels renewed after all that treatment, and as they leave the establishment, Fate thanks Roxy for her help. However, she says that she is the one who should thank him, because thanks to Fate, she discovered a little more about the monster that is out there, and he questions why Roxy didn't know the truth about the hunt. And she explains that the Vlarik family is controlling the information, and isn't telling her anything. Well, speaking of them, they both hear Hado's voice, and a child asks for help. Until Roxy goes to the Knights and tells Hado to release the boy. Memel says that they were just taking the child to protect her, and then Roxy is surprised to know that she was also involved in that. And Fate goes to Hado to rescue the child, and Roxy questions why Raphael didn't say anything to her about the hunt for the monster that's out there, and he cynically says he didn't want to bother her, due to Hado's recent death, her father. But Roxy says she's fine with that, and then Raphael turns his back to leave, but Hado tries to humiliate Fate beforehand, but is asked to leave soon. And after they go, the boy says that he hates the Holy Knights, and upon hearing this, Roxy apologizes, and he asks why she is apologizing, and she understands that the boy didn't realize that she is one of them, because of her clothes. And then the boy explains that he lost his mother, and Fate says that she will help him find her, and while they were helping the boy, Fate remembers that he was also lost as a child, and says that right after his father died he would have moved to the capital. And because he was in a new place, he ended up getting lost, but ended up being rescued by a holy knight, who was kind to him, so he wonders where she was. And well, it starts to get late, and they tell the boy that they won't be able to continue looking for his mother that day, but Roxy says that he could spend the night at her house, and explains that they will look for her again the next day. But at that moment the boy's mother appears, and Fate feels relieved that they found his mother, but when he looks at Roxy, he realizes that she felt even happier. And then he starts to stare at her, and the girl notices this, but Fate disagrees, saying that it would be better for them to go back, so as not to have any problems. And Roxy asks if he will continue to be by her side when they come to scold them, and he promptly says that he will be by her side at that moment too. And after he confirms this, she says that they could return home, and Fate reflects in his mind that he would like to live that forever. However, he talks greedily, and asks about a way to hunt the monsters without Roxy discovering him. So Greed gives him a mask that changes perception. In this case, when he puts it on, people around him will see them in a different way, and this will mean that neither Fate nor Greed will be recognized. But when he looks to the side, he sees the merchant from before staring at him, and well, the next day, Fate presents Roxy with a jewel, and says that it is to thank her for the work she gave him. And he is also grateful for the friends he met there, who he now considers part of his family, so she accepts the gift and thanks him, and he explains that he would have liked to have taken the gem she liked. But Roxy thanks her anyway, and when she breaks the ore, she comes across a beautiful jewel that leaves her enchanted, and Fate says she is happy that she liked the gift. And Roxy questions what he wants in return, and suggests giving him meat for the whole year. After all, he seems to like it a lot, but he says she doesn't need to worry about returning the kindness, and in the meantime, the Vlarik family gets together to discuss the excursion to Gallia. And after taking down all the goblins, Fate stares at the hunters, and everyone runs away as they thought he was the monster everyone was talking about, the so-called Lich, the corpse. And upon hearing this name, Greed feels proud, as he thinks it's a good name for a warrior, and asks if Fate had already finished the killing, but he says no, and explains that he wants to increase his status as much as he can, before the Holy Knights locate him. Well, the next day, Fate returns to his life as a common worker, and says that having a double life is not easy at all, and then Roxy appears, and goes to him to inform him that she has a secret mission to assign him, and he wonders if there would be another inspection. But she doesn't answer anything and just takes him away, and on the way Roxy points to a place, and explains that that land belongs to the Hart family, and Fate asks if their secret mission would be to collect grapes. And Roxy explains that she just wanted to show him the land, and well, they arrive at her mother's house, and she says she's feeling much better that day. However, Roxy advises her not to try too hard. And she notices that her daughter brought a boy with her, and she says that he is one of her contractors, and explains that she brought him to introduce him to everyone, and then he introduces himself. Then Roxy's mother introduces herself as Aisha Hart, and says she is happy with his presence. And Greed comments that she seems to be a nice lady, and Aisha asks Fate to come to her, and when he gets closer, she asks if he likes her daughter, and this leaves him in shock, as it was a question very surprised. And Roxy says that she asked a very sudden question, but Aisha explains that she just wants to know his opinion about Roxy. After all, she is his boss, and upon hearing this they both breathe a sigh of relief, especially because they were thinking something else. And Roxy says that she should have explained this before, and well, Fate says that she really likes her daughter, and reveals that she wants to serve her until the end of her life, and that makes her mother happy. But Roxy he is embarrassed and says he will rest in his room. Then he asks if he said something wrong, and Aisha says that her daughter always runs away when things get uncomfortable for her. That is, she wouldn't have changed anything, and then Fate asks more about it, and Aisha says that since she was little, Roxy was very crying, and couldn't see an insect that was already having a panic attack. And Fate says she can't imagine her acting like that nowadays, and Aisha reveals that she still can't believe that her daughter has become a holy knight, and she says that seeing her daughter trying hard makes her very worried, because in addition to losing her father, she now has a huge responsibility as head of the family. But Fate tries to reassure her, and says that Roxy is an excellent holy knight, and also says that she holds the faith of all her people. In addition, he explains that the girl performs her duties well as head of the house. Well, Roxy goes to her room and looks closely at a photograph of her father, and then a memory comes into her mind, where her father is teaching her how to handle the sword, and he appears to be surprised that she managed to become a holy knight. And Roxy says she wants to be the kind of holy knight he is, that is, the one who laughs along with all his people, without arrogance, and her father says that this character is what makes her part of the Hart family, and Roxy says she still hasn't been able to keep that promise. Well, she goes back to the plantation of grapes together with Fate, and one of the co-workers offers him some juice, so that Fate can regain his energy, and the boy is amazed by the taste of those grapes. His colleague explains that you personally helped to cultivate that land for several generations, and he says that everyone on the property is proud to be collaborators in creating that juicy grape. And Fate asks if this also applies to Mason, and the man immediately wipes the smile off his face, and says that he found out about his death in Gallia, and because it was a difficult time for Roxy, they didn't imagine that she would come to that land so soon. Well, Fate asks if Roxy has the habit of helping with the harvest every year, and her colleague responds that in addition to doing that, she also helps by hunting monsters, and he explains that that was the harvest time for most cultures. And not just grapes, so this is the time when more monsters appear in search of food. And the monsters of the moment would be the kobolds, who come from the northern valley, and well, he has his explanation interrupted by Fate's stomach, but he is understanding about it, and says that Fate worked a lot, and so he should be really hungry. In this, Greed explains that killing those goblins was not enough, as their gluttony is hungry for different souls, so Fate should feed it even more. And after finishing the work, Roxy goes to Fate, and tells him to come back without her, as the girl will need to stay to do other things there. He then follows his path, until he comes across a girl, and when analyzing her, he realizes that she is not from there. However, he continues to go straight, but when they cross paths, the girl calls him, and Fate notices that she has eyes like his, and well, he asks if she needs anything, and the girl looks at him for a few seconds and says that got there too soon. Then he asks what she is talking about, and the girl explains that she was after the kobolds, but says that Fate could stay with them. Then she says goodbye saying that they will see each other again. Well, he asks Greed who the girl would be, but he says he doesn't know, but Fate asks him again, and says he definitely knows something, because Greed always says a lot of things without being asked. But this time he was very silent. And Greed asks him to leave that matter aside, and says that even he, with all his greatness, can end up not knowing something. Well, Roxy appears again, and gives a basket of grapes to Fate. And then he asks what she had gone to do at that time, and she replies that she went to get some of the grapes, and says that that girl from before was a Gallian, but Fate remembers having heard rumors that said that Gallia had been destroyed. And then Roxy explains that 4,000 years ago, Gallia was a great military power, but suddenly a wave of monsters caused the collapse of this entire nation, causing the majority of its people to die. Their Fate comments that there must be some survivors left from this attack, and Roxy says that she had never seen a pure-blooded Gallian before, and well, she advises that they go back too, and on the way Faye comments that she heard about the hunt for the monsters that the girl will participate, and asks if she will be okay alone. And Roxy explains that she will be accompanied by the warriors who work there. Besides, she reassures him, saying that she is a holy knight, so she would be fine. But when posing, she ends up dropping the grapes. Well, the next day the residents of that land face a disaster. All the grapes there were eaten by the beasts, and then everyone goes to the kobolds, to hunt them, and suddenly some vegetation starts to sway a lot, and then an unknown beast comes out of the woods, leaving everyone amazed. And that beast leaves Fate's mouth watering. Besides, he was already almost dead from hunger, and that worries him, as he couldn't let Roxy see him like that, so he decides that he should attack before his gluttony reaches its limit. And when analyzing the enemy, he discovers that it is the bringer of lamentation, a crowned beast, and then Greed explains that he is a powerful monster born from aggression accumulated over a long time, and this makes him much further away from common monsters. Basically this would be bad news for Fate. And at that everyone retreats, and the hunter says that they don't have the slightest chance against that beast, but Roxy says that they don't need to worry about that, as she will kill him alone. After all, she is a holy knight, and would have the duty to use all his power to defend his people and his land. And although she shows firmness in her words, Greed says that she cannot do it alone, as that beast is too much for such a young holy knight. But still the hunters plan to prepare for the attack that will occur the next day. And Roy asks them to equip themselves with whatever is possible. So Greed asks what Fate would do in this situation, and he confesses that a level 50 monster is too much for him at the moment. However, Fate doesn't think it's right to ignore the disaster that those monsters are causing in Heart's lands. In addition, he is also determined not to let Roxy die, and so, he tells Greed that the two of them will fix it. And as night falls, Fate goes to the kobold's lair, and Greed comments that he must really be interested in that subject. But Fate tells him to shut up, and Greed continues talking anyway, and warns him about there being many kobold warriors around the crowned beast. And he questions whether Fate has a plan, and he says that he will fight like a glutton and starts shooting several arrows at the kobolds, and then his gluttony ability is activated, and Fate continues shooting until he gets closer to the crowned beast. And when he shoots at it, the beast simply takes one of his kobolds and puts it in front, so as not to suffer the blow without any consideration. Well, Fate notes that he still hasn't satisfied his gluttony, even after having killed many kobolds. And then he aims his attack at the beast, and when he shoots, Fate feels confident, and thinks he has already won the fight. But the crowned beast holds the arrows in his hands, and Greed says that the way is for them to go up and cut it into pieces. However, when he gets very close, Greed notices that the beast is making use of an art of the brawling skill called Ruin Attack, and he explains that that skill allows the enemy to penetrate the opponent's armor, in order to break his bones and pulverize your organs. And then Fate tries to retreat, but is inflicted by a blow. Then the beast sends a gust of wind at him, which makes him fall into the water, whereupon Greed asks Fate to get up in a hurry, but he waits for the beast to go up, so he can launch a surprise attack. And Greed understands that Fate was just pretending to be freezing to death, and says that that trick was pretty clever, and well, after killing a few more monsters, Greed tells him that Fate should be able to use her first-level occult art, and he explains that he will need 10% of his current stats to be able to do this. And then Fate agrees to use the occult art, and then he launches the bloody ptarmigan onto the crowned beast, and finishes it off. And Greed comments that the health regeneration ability he got from the Goblin King would already have the cure. And he comments to Greed that that hidden ability was very appealing, and well, Fate starts to feel strange out of nowhere, in which Greed explains that he is just overwhelmed, as that was the first higher-level soul that he would have devoured. And Greed asks him to hold on, because if Fate loses control, the result will be worse than if he were in the state of hunger. Well, the next day Roxy and the others go to the crowned beast's lair, and notice that there are injuries of sword and arrow on monsters. But what catches her attention the most is that trail across the land, and after that, she comments to her family that the place was completely devastated, and Fate mentally apologizes for the exaggeration. Then Aisha questions who could have done something like that, and Roxy tells her about the Galleon girl they saw that day, and explains that those people are usually more powerful than the Holy Knights, and then she deduces that it could have been the girl. And as she speaks, Aisha notices that her daughter smiles and has a much more uplifted face when she is close to Fate, and after that, she talks alone with him, and asks Fate to stay by her daughter's side, to support her, but he says he doesn't feel worthy of such prestige. But Aisha explains that she does not want his support as an authority or force, like that of a holy knight. In his case, Aisha says that the greatest value is in her heart, as Fate has a genuine desire to serve her daughter. And she explains that she came from an ordinary family and had no skills, just like Fate, but still, she managed to support her husband, and she says that having only one holy knight father made Roxy's life difficult in parts. Well, she starts coughing, and Fate goes to her to help her. And Aisha says that she doesn't have long to live, and that's why she wants Fate to stay by her daughter's side, and support her in her place. But still, Aisha understands that he might not have the immediate answer, and he apologizes for rushing him. But Fate says he will think about his request. And on the way back he wonders if he really deserves to take on this role in Roxy's life. After all, he is deceiving everyone and carrying the secret of his ability to gluttony. Well, he goes back to hunting goblins, but he feels that it's still not enough to satisfy his hunger. But Fate notices that there are no monsters stronger than goblins around, and Greed says that his time is running out, so he should decide soon what to do from there. Well, after that, he goes to his old friend's establishment, and still doesn't think he's worthy of being at Roxy's side. Then Ad appears and comments that Hado will join in the hunt for the corpse, and the boss says that this is his way of getting some glory with a simple mission. And Ad suggests that Hado be sent to Gallia, so she can risk becoming monster food, but the boss says that people like him always stay in a comfort zone, and says that they will certainly send other people to Gallia. And Fate asks about this expedition to Gallia taking place right after Muzin's death, and Ad says that this matter will be resolved soon, and he fears for what might happen on this expedition. Well, Roxy and the others prepare for the expedition, but first she goes to her father's grave and talks to him about being assigned to this mission, and asks him to protect her on this trip. And then Fate appears behind her, and asks Roxy not to go on this expedition, because if she goes now, maybe she won't come back. But she tells him that she has already decided that she would go, and Greed explains that the Hart family is uncomfortable for the Vleriks and the other holy knights. So there are rumors that they were the ones who organized this expedition to Gallia. Well, K1LL celebrates with Hato about this expedition, as they will finally get rid of that hassle, and Hato says that he would also like to go to Tenburn with them. But K1LL explains that that trip is not just fun, but a research trip. So Raffaele asks her to tell the truth. After all, he didn't buy the idea that K1LL was just going to do research on immortality. And well, he turns to Hato, and says he's counting on him to capture the Lich, and meanwhile, Fate is confused as to what to do now, as he doesn't have enough authority to stop Roxy, but he doesn't think it's right letting them treat people like trash, causing them suffering. Well, the Holy Knights finally show up and ask Fate if he would be that corpse. After finding the corpse, Hato's Monty asks so they can finish him off, and then the men are allowed to attack. But Fate is able to predict their movements because they are very slow, and so he takes down all the men. And when they look at Fate's red, demonic eye, the implementation guys get scared and run away, leaving Hato behind. He gets angry and says that the corpse is a mere monster, so he would defeat him himself. Then the corpse starts to take off its mask, and Hato soon realizes that it is Fate, and questions how a guy like him has so much power, and Fate says that there is no reason to explain anything. But upon hearing this, Hato says again that he won't get away with it, but he says this while shaking. However, he tries to pay back as a badass and says that he is one of the Holy Knights, so Fate asks him to show the power of a Holy Knight. Well, when looking at the opponent's stats, he notices that Hato has the Sacred Sword technique, and says that only those who have this special ability can call themselves a Holy Knight. However, Fate wonders why a guy like Hato would have this. Well, he questions whether Greed is capable of destroying a sacred sword, and he says that he would never have difficulty destroying an artificial and impure sword. And then Fate feels relieved to know this, and points his sword at Hato, and because he pointed the sword at a relatively short distance, Hato calls him rubbish, and says that he doesn't have even a shred of understanding. Then he attacks him with Grand Cross, and is soon convinced that he won the fight. But Fate appears behind him and says that his ability takes a long time to activate, and then he attacks Hato's sword and breaks it, and this leaves him surprised, as he did not expect that his sword would be destroyed. And Fate returns the remains of his holy sword, but Hato begins to retreat, and Fate questions whether he really deserves to be called a Holy Knight acting like that, and calls him pathetic. And as he gets closer to Hato, the guy falls to the ground, but Fate lifts him up and says that he needs a lesson because disobedient dogs need to be well disciplined, and Hato understands this philosophy of life very well. However, he tries to ask for mercy, but Fate attacks him against the wall anyway, and Hato goes back to begging him to stop, and Fate says that it's a lot of nerve for him to ask that after everything he's done. After all, he treats everyone like real insects, and Fate says that because of guys like him, Roxy is heading towards danger. And even with him being confronted with all these truths of his actions, Hato goes back to begging for forgiveness, and again Fate wasn't very willing to forgive him, as the guy never granted him forgiveness when he asked. He then throws him away, and uses his bloody Lego pod technique, causing the surrounding fog to disappear. But Hato notices that Fate threw the power into the sky, and questions why he missed the blow on purpose, and says he wants to be killed soon. But he says that before he kills him, he wants to ask something, and Hato asks if it would be about Roxy Hart, and says that if so, she herself made it clear that she would go to Gaul for her own interest, because for Roxy, if she is able to save a single citizen of that kingdom, your death will be worth it. And upon hearing this, Fate resigns, and says that this is something she would really talk about, and well, Hato says that he can cancel Roxy's trip to Gaul if he spares him, but Fate aims his sword at him and tells him to keep quiet, and says that he will only kill him. It out of personal revenge. After all, Hato also did a lot of harm to Fate. He then plunges his sword into his chest and finally kills him, causing him to unlock the Holy Sword technique as well, in which Greed says that Fate has just become a Holy Knight, as he has the same technique as them. However, he says that the capital would never accept him as one, and furthermore, Fate shows disgust at being a Holy Knight, as people like Hato corrupted the reputation that these warriors had. And well, Greed explains that he is now able to use his second level, and Fate says that Greed could drain his status, and says that he feels disgusted to have Hato's status in his body, and then the sword starts to evolve, and when it reaches level 2 it turns into a large scythe. And Greed explains that the curse imbued in the blade can cut even something ephemeral, that is, it is capable of cutting anything. But Fate says that he just wanted to be able to cut Roxy's expedition to Gallia. Well, the day of the expedition finally arrives, and she says goodbye to everyone, and says that 3 years will fly by, so they won't need to worry about her. And Roxy tells Haru that she will leave everything under her responsibility, and Haru asks the girl to do a good job as the leader of the Heart family. Well, she goes to Fate too, and says that they will see each other soon, and although he is worried, Fate decides to take a more confident stance, and wishes Roxy good luck on the trip, and then she leaves on horseback, and Haru says that she left a letter of recommendation for him, which said that if he is in a lord's mansion, the Vleriks cannot come near him. And then Fate notices that she was protecting him and worrying about him until the end, but he says that he couldn't accept that protection, and says that from now on he will live as a warrior. And after that he comments to Greed that if he cannot prevent Roxy from going to Gallia, he will at least provide her with the necessary support. And well, the next day he leaves for Gallia too, and receives his money and his severance pay for the work he did for House Heart, and Haru tells him to never forget the pride of having once served the Heart family, and then she wishes you good luck. And on the way he feels determined to protect Roxy with all the power he has acquired in recent months, and meanwhile one of the sacred knights stands at the top of the city watching the movement, and feels that things are going according to their plan. And well, Roxy gives a speech to everyone, and says that she is the successor of her father, Mason Heart, a holy knight who died trying to defeat the divine dragon that awakened after a millennium of silence, and she says that to defend the royal capital, Seafort, and his people, Roxy will need to count on their support. And after the speech she finds Miria, and asks if she is also going to Gallia, and she says yes. Then a guy appears there and says that he also volunteered for the expedition, but when he calls Miria a young lady, she already turns away. And the man introduces himself as Mugan, but she says she already knows his type and says that he is just another emotional person who wants to see the disaster of the divine dragon just to test his strength without caring about the lives of others. And Mugan says that in fact most warriors want to test how far they can go. And Miria goes back to belittling him, calling him an idiot, and Roxy says that she is overdoing herself. But upon hearing this the girl is happy, as she sees the scolding as an honor. And well, the warrior explains that he only volunteered for that expedition because of Mason Heart and says that he once marched under his orders, and although it may seem presumptuous of him, Mugan says that he wants to avenge Mason's death. And upon hearing this, Roxy thanks him, and asks what his family thought about his trip to Gallia, and he says that his daughter asked Mugan to bring a relic from there as a gift, and he explains that his family is from a lineage of researchers, and he would be the only warrior among them all. And Miria gets into trouble with him again, saying that everything is cool, except him, and he jokes back, saying that she's talking too much, to which Roxy says that she can continue the trip more lightly with them around. And well, a girl catches Rain's attention, and explains that those goblins at the place were killed by Lich, the corpse that everyone has been talking about, and she analyzes that the wounds on the monster's skin are not common from arrows, and Rain says that that is quite fascinating. She then goes to her book, and says that she imagined that those injuries were caused by a mana arrow, and she explains that this is an ability contained in a black sword. In this case it would be one of the weapons of Capital Sin. And Rain explains that the Capital Sin weapons are made of a material that can manipulate mana at a high level, but the girl next to her doesn't understand anything about the subject, and asks what these Capital Sin weapons are, and Rain he says he doesn't know, and explains that if it's a possible weapon to control mana, that would expand his possibilities. And Rain confesses that she would like to see one of these deadly sin weapons, and well, the driver tells everyone that they will soon arrive in Tetra, and upon hearing this Fate wakes up, and notices that the location is the Maritime Transport Center that connects to Royal Capital, and he explains that that city has many fishermen. In addition, the place has the best merchandise. In this Fate concludes that Tetra hasn't changed practically anything, and Greed asks if he's been there before, and he says he was there 5 years ago. Well, he keeps walking and finds a man, and then he questions if his carriage would go to Gaul. And he says he wouldn't go out today because if he goes out he will be attacked by monsters, but he says that Fate could go there the next day, and Greed regrets that, After all, Fate was in a hurry to find Roxy, so he goes back to wander around, until his stomach growls, and Greed reminds him that in addition to gathering information he will also need to fill his belly. And he says that after that they must hunt for a worthy scabbard for him to use. But Fate doesn't show much excitement in spending money on it. But Greed explains that now Fate has the skill of sacred sword technique, that is, now they would need an appropriate hem. And he already suggests one decorated with orichalcum and magic crystals, just to start, and then Fate remembers that he still has his termination, so he'll be able to do all that, and he says he'll take advantage of it to eat a lot of meat. And meanwhile, a merchant asks for help from warriors, and offers money for them to help him hunt the monsters, but one of them throws the money on the ground, and says that they won't hunt monsters for so little. But he decides to humiliate the man too, and says that if he wants their help he will have to show how much he wants it. And then Fate appears to intervene, and the men decide to leave the merchant alone, and after that he recognizes that man as Set, and then Set also recognizes him, and remembers when they were little. At this point, Set remembers taking one with Fate's face, as his stomach was always growling, while Fate, he has memories of when he hunted and prepared herbs with his father, in which he praises how good his son is with the herbs, and Fate explains that he does this because his father keeps hurting himself. And after taking the medicine, his father smiles gently and says that the medicine is really very bitter, and well, after the death of his father, Fate is sad and lamenting in his grave, while the local residents complain, and say that Fate is dead weight, as now they will have to find somewhere for him to stay. And then they start throwing rocks at him, telling him to leave. Well, back to the present, Set begs for his help, and Fate remembers that Set is the son of the village leader who exiled him. But the boy continues to beg helps, and says that he will be able to help him now that he has become a warrior. Then Greed says that they will need to feed their gluttony anyway, so Fate accepts the mission to hunt monsters, and upon leaving, he comments to Greed that he still hates Set, but explains that his memories with his father are in his village. And well, he takes Fate to the others, but soon his father disapproves of the idea. But Set explains that the boy is strong, and says that he saw Fate defeat some warriors alone, but he still insists on refusing the offer, and says that the next day he will hire a good warrior. But the other men say that the monsters can attack in the middle of the night, and one of them comments that he heard the creatures scream from a nearby forest, to which Set's father changes his mind, and says that he will use Fate as a sacrifice and to buy time, until they find another warrior. And Set asks him to ignore his father's harsh words, and well, they enter the house, and Set apologizes to him for what happened, to which Fate says he's used to it, and asks how his wife is, and Set says that the monsters took her, and explains that your villa is always with you poor, because what their leader says is absolute, and Set confesses that he already agreed with the things his father said. And he says that since his daughter was born, he understood that he must always be firm, so that he can protect her, and upon seeing this, Fate notices that he has changed a lot, and Set says that it was all thanks to his daughter. Well, Fate asks him to talk about the monsters, and he explains that they first appeared a month ago. And he says that according to the witnesses, it wouldn't just be a monster, besides, the monster can apparently fly, and that would make things much more serious, and Set explains that that's what made him want to hire a warrior. Well, the Fate stomach starts to growl, and Set goes out to get him something to eat. In this, Greed comments that the boy thought things would work out if he hired a warrior, and he says that this is typical of residents of small villages, but Greed warns that the fact that the monster knows how to fly will make things more complicated. Fate asks if he has any idea what these beings are, and Greed says that they are possibly gargoyles, a type of very intelligent monster, and he explains that gargoyles usually attack little by little, to observe humans, but when they arrive at a specific moment, they attack in groups. And then Fate compares them to kobolds, but the little girl interrupts the conversation and asks who he's talking to, but he replies that it was his thing, so she offers Fate a sweet, and to talk things out he calls the girl to play with him. Iron Arm. And well, Set brings soup and bread to Fate, and apologizes for only having that, but he thanks her anyway, and when eating the soup he starts to feel dizzy and faints, but his daughter comments that she gave Fate the candy that his grandfather had given. Then Set understands that his grandfather was actually serious when he said he was going to use Fate as a sacrifice, and Greed notices that it was sweet with a sleeping pill, and then Set tries to wake him up, but he can't, at which point he screams from the outside. And when he goes out to look, Set comes across two flying creatures. As they are attacked, Greed tries to wake Fate, but he continues sleeping, and the sword notes that he will not wake up so easily, due to having been drugged, so the village chief runs desperately while calling for Fate, but he is captured by one of the creatures before that. And Set gives Fate an antidote to take to repel the drug from his body, and upon seeing this, Greed comments that Set really knows how to make good use of the herbs in his village, so Fate asks where he is, and Set says he is at his home, and explains that Fate was drugged and put to sleep. At this the boy doesn't understand anything, and Set comments that this was something plotted by his father, and well, Fate notices the danger that is outside, and asks Set to remain in the house, so he takes his sword and leaves to outside, and soon comes across a very grotesque scene of destruction. And when looking at the monsters, Fate is amazed, and Greed explains that they will have problems if the monsters continue shooting at them, and well, Fate analyzes the enemy's status, and notes that they are level 27 monsters, and that they have the ability Fireball. And then Greed says that this ability can cause a lot of problems for them, so Fate should use the Great Scythe, in which the boy follows Greed's advice, but the monster attacks him again with a fireball, in which Fate dodges and attacks the fire. But he notices that the scythe was unable to cut the ephemeral, and Greed explains that the scythe cuts magic, not the fire caused by it, and Fate says that he now understands how things work, and Greed says that the monsters also understand. After all, now the creature's objective is to cause a general fire in the place, instead of just hitting it. But Fate manages to prevent their action, and kills some of the monsters, and with that his gluttony ability is activated, and he acquires the fireball skill. And after killing almost everyone, there was still the leader of the group, and when analyzing his stats, Fate discovers that he is a level 47 monster, and has fireball and fire resistance skills. And then Greed alerts Fate that the enemy intends to approach and hit him with a fireball, so this would be the best time for Fate to attack, so the boy goes on the attack too, and destroys the leader of the monsters. And the next day, Set tells Fate that his father was killed, and that only a few villagers survived, including him, and then Fate analyzes the place with his ID, and says that the land there is completely devastated and infertile. In this, Set questions why he makes a living being a warrior, after all this is very dangerous, and he could make money just with his ability to identify. And upon hearing this, Fate becomes lost in his thoughts, and remembers that gluttony is an ability that defies divine law. And he turns to Set and says that he has no choice but to fight, and Set comments that he will look for a job in the city, so she can take care of her daughter with more dignity. And well, the nowhere boy asks Fate to hit him, so he can pay for all the bad things he did to him in the past, and Greed says that Fate should do what Set is asking, because it will help him feel less guilty of his actions. Then Fate asks the boy to grit his teeth and attacks him right away, but Greed calls him an idiot as he got excited about the punch. But Set thanks him for that blow, and Fate lifts him up, and asks him to take good care of his daughter. And well, Fate says he hates to see the village disappear, no matter how bad it may have been. However, the memories of his time with his father in the village are still not gone, and he goes to his father's grave, to say that it will be fine from now on. And meanwhile, Roxy was getting closer from Lancaster territory, and Mugan asks her to be careful with the Lord of Lancaster, and then Roxy questions what he means by that, and he says that she will find out once they get there. Then Miria starts to grumble at him because of Mugan being a cheap little secret in the middle of the mission, and meanwhile, Fate heads towards the same destination as Roxy, but he was sleepy, and the man who was taking him asks if Fate was really on guard. After all, he couldn't stop yawning. And the man says he's paying him 3 gold coins, so he's trusting Fate, in case things get difficult, so Greed disdains the guy, saying he's thinking he's too much just because he's paying someone else's 3 coins. And Fate says that the man doesn't need to worry, and explains that he is very skilled in combat, and as much as it may not seem like he is almost as strong as a novice holy knight, and upon hearing this, the man feels relieved. And further on, a man stops the carriage, and says that the road is closed. In addition, they order them to give everything they have of value, so that he can spare their lives, in which Fate goes to the subjects and challenges them, and upon seeing so many guys, Greed comments that he should have asked for a higher salary, and Fate says that his sword really lives up to its name. And well, the man in the carriage jumps at his feet, and begs Fate to save him from those men, and he asks the man to let him go. After all, he wouldn't be able to fight with him arresting him, and upon seeing this, the leader of the carriage gang comments that their prey is shaking in fear. And then out of nowhere a weapon flies towards the bandits, and they are thrown away. Then the dust settles, and Fate notices that it is the same girl from before, and she says that Fate owed her for those kobolds that her girl let him kill, so she asks him to give her a ride. Then the man in the carriage says he will give her a ride, as she helped them, but upon entering, the carriage tips over, and she asks for her weapon to return to normal size, and then Fate realizes that the weight of the weapon has changed. And on the way she comments to Fate that she still doesn't know his name, and he introduces himself. Then the girl calls him Fate de Gluttony, and he questions how she knows that, and the girl explains that she also has a cardinal sin ability, so it would be obvious for her to know this. But Fate says he doesn't know what she's talking about, and the girl asks if Greed hasn't told him anything yet, so the sword starts whistling to pretend she doesn't understand, and the girl introduces herself as Mine of Wrath, so her stomach starts to growl, and Fate offers her some jerky. And then the man in the carriage tells them that they are almost arriving in the city, and meanwhile, a girl walks happily there but is surprised by two ghosts. Then a holy knight appears, promising to save her, and after finishing them off, the girl goes to him and asks his name. And then he introduces himself as Rudolph, the Lord of Lancaster, and all the girls around start giving him a hard time. But Greed finds the whole spectacle very strange, and the man in the carriage explains that Rudolph is getting ready to receive the gala expedition. And Fate asks if this would be the expedition led by Roxy, and the man answers yes, and explains that they should arrive in the city soon. And upon hearing this, Greed bursts into laughter. After all, Fate ended up arriving in the city before Roxy herself, and he explains that they probably took longer because there were more people in the carriage, so it makes sense that they would be slower. And well, the man gives the 3 gold coins to Fate, as agreed, but Mine enters between the two and takes the coins for herself and says that it was she who saved them, and Greed grumbles at that, and calls her of greedy. But Fate doesn't try to retort, and just questions what to do from now on. And Greed says they should look for a place to stay, so Mine starts sleeping on his shoulder, and Fate tells the girl to stop sleeping standing up. Well, she remains unconscious, and Fate carries her on his back. There Greed explains that the girl is not a morning person, so he would have to deal with that, and Fate comments that Greed and Mine seem to know each other very well, and second later, 2 young men welcome them in the name of Rudolph. In this, Fate notes that the citizens revere the holy knights as if they were gods. And by analyzing men better, Fate notices that there is a symbol on the back of one of the men's heads, but when looking at other guys, he notices that they all have a different symbol per person, and well, another citizen welcomes them, and Fate sees a different symbol on the back of the man's head. On the back of the young man's head, and Greed explains that these symbols may serve to differentiate the social classes of each citizen. Furthermore, Greed explains that the lord of that place doesn't even care about this caste system that his city has become, because everyone must idolize and love him anyway. And meanwhile, Rudolph complains to some citizens because he didn't like their idea for the ceremony, and he says that it's not the best way to convey how wonderful his family is. And Rudolph says that the purpose of that ceremony is to demonstrate his family's superiority in relation to the hearts, in which one of the citizens begs for forgiveness, but Rudolph kills him without mercy. Then he kills the other man too. And upon seeing this, the other citizens are in shock because Rudolph is becoming more and more evil, and any mistake from them could cost them their lives. And well, Fate finally finds a place to stay, and Fate asks Greed how he knows to Mine, and he explains that they are old acquaintances who keep running into each other, and that also goes for laziness, her axe. And he explains that laziness is like him, that is, it is a weapon of the deadly sins, and Fate remembers that Mine had commented on the abilities of the deadly sins, and he asks Greed what those things would be. And he says it's time for Fate to learn about these skills, in which Greed counts as these skills. In this case they are gluttony, wrath, greed, laziness, lust, envy, and pride, and all of these are skills that were born to challenge the laws of the divine. and that is why they are called abilities and weapons of the deadly sins. And the most challenging of all is gluttony herself, as she has the potential to overthrow the divine leveling system, and fate understands that once gluttony tests souls, there is no stopping her, and that would be her punishment, and greed says they all must pay somehow, and that goes for mine as well. However, fate wonders why he is the one who has this, because this ability only harms him, leaving him hungry all the time, and when he had thought he had gained some power, fate discovered that this would also be a punishment. After all, I would need to keep killing to survive. So he asks himself again what that power is for, and greed says that thinking in that negative way could cost him dearly one day, because if his mind is not resistant, gluttony will dominate him, and greed explains that fate needs remain in a state of near starvation. And well, they go to the monster area, and greed says that he can't satisfy gluttony all at once, as he needs to get used to satisfying himself little by little. Then a sandman appears, and greed tells fate to cast a fireball before firing the arrow. And fate notices that he is able to add the fireball ability to the magic arrow, and after hitting him, another sandman appears, and greed tells fate to control himself so as not to attack yet. And well, mine finally wakes up, and when walking through the room, the girl sees an advertisement on the wall which says that whoever defeats the sand golem will be rewarded. However, a gentleman explains that not even Rudolph is capable of defeat the sand golem, but if it doesn't kill him, only death will be left for him, and in the meantime, fate continues his training to control temptation, and greed says that he is doing very well, and fate says that the feeling is the same as drinking just one drop of water at a time in the desert. Then greed says that now is the time for him to satisfy gluttony completely. After all, he doesn't want fate to go crazy, and the boy smells a crowned beast nearby, and greed says that this monster will serve as an excellent main feast. Several warriors were there to fight the creature, but fate appears to challenge him, and the warriors say he cannot defeat that creature without their help, and greed asks if he is playing at being a hero again. However, fate says that he is just looking for his self-satisfaction, and well, he attacks the beast with a fireball and goes up, whereupon the monster attacks him with his sandstorm, and greed explains that if fate is pulled by the storm, he will be crushed by rocks. And then he says he will cut the monster and its spell, and fate uses his scythe to cut the spell, and then goes at him, to cut him too, but the monster disappears out of nowhere, and greed explains that his core just went into the sand. Then fate prepares the bloody ptarmigan attack, and greed says he will need 20% of his stats to do so, and then they manage to kill the beast, and fate learns the sandstorm skill. And then the other warriors praise him, and one of them says that he had never seen a warrior as powerful as this, and they thank him, and fate says that he just gave them a helping hand, and the leader of the warriors introduces himself as Bard, and to not handing over his identity, fate introduces himself to them as Corpse. And Bard questions if that's all his equipment, so fate understands that maybe he should buy more, but greed says that he doesn't need that, as he can steal his enemies' abilities, to increase their statistics. And this would be the power to defy the concept of level that greed had explained. Well, the next day mine goes to take a shower, and fate asks if she isn't embarrassed for being naked in his presence, and mine explains that he's just a child, so he would have no reason to be embarrassed by him. And after the girl gets dressed, fate asks if she is going somewhere, and she says she is going to hunt the sand golem, but fate reveals that she has already finished with him, and the girl turns into a beast. After all, she wants the reward, but fate says she can keep half the money. So he goes to the reception to get his 100 gold coins, and mine questions why he is wearing that ridiculous mask, and he explains that he fought the golem as the corpse, so he should get his reward as the corpse too. And well, Rudolph suddenly appears, and says that fate will serve him from now on, as he is responsible for ending the most dangerous monster in the place. But fate shows that he doesn't have that much interest in that, but Rudolph explains that he doesn't have the right to refuse anything, for when a holy knight makes a decision, others must only obey. Then mine goes to him and says that fate will not be able to serve him, as he is already hers, and Rudolph says that a girl like her should be at home with her mother, but she shows who is boss, and throws him away. And then fate tells her that now the two should leave the city as soon as possible, so they stop the man in the carriage, and ask for a ride again. Fate wonders if mine doesn't have gluttony instead of anger, as the girl hasn't stopped eating since they left, and she responds that anger burns a lot of calories, and he notices that the girl eats a lot but her body doesn't develop. And upon hearing this, Mine gets stressed and destroys the carriage, and while the man repairs the vehicle, Fate notices that the girl is walking towards somewhere, so he follows her, and they arrive in a small peaceful village, and Greed explains that they are close to Gaul, so the influence of the monsters is very strong. And he deduces that there is possibly someone very powerful protecting this village, and Fate notices that there is a castle in the background. And when analyzing the entire scenario, Greed notices that they are in Hausen, and Fate finds that strange, as he thought there was only a castle in Hausen. Seaford over there. Well, he finds a guy sitting sharpening his sword, and asks him where the leader of the village is, and he turns around and says he's the leader of that village, and when he sees his sword, Greed says he's a holy knight, and he is probably the one who protects that village. And well, you allow Fate to stay in the village for a few days, but in exchange he would have to have a duel with him, and then the boy uses his ability to identify, and you recognize this technique. In addition, the knight note that even though Fate is level 1, he has more than 2 million statuses. And when he notices that the Holy Knight also has the identity, Fate is amazed, and the Lord draws his sword and asks if he will duel or not. Then Fate goes on the attack, but the Lord disarms him and surrenders him, and with that Fate understands that he cannot stay in the village, but the knight denies this statement, and says that the meeting between the two must have some purpose, so he could stay there. But the man says that he will only let him stay there if Fate trains with him every day he stays in the village, so the boy questions why he wants to train him, and he replies that it is just on a personal whim, but Greed says that something there is suspicious. And you explain that Fate doesn't know how to avoid identification. In addition, he isn't making the most of his other skills, and for the knight, Fate's body isn't used to his strength, therefore the way the boy fighting only works against monsters, but not other humans. And the man states that Fate will have nothing to lose with his instructions, and he asks if the boy would accept his training, and Greed says again that there is something suspicious about this man, as he is offering all of this without wanting anything in return. Replacement. However, Fate comments to Greed that it is not every day that one receives an offer to train with a holy knight, and so he accepts the offer and presents it to the Lord, and the holy knight introduces himself as Aaron Barbatos. Then Mine appears, and Fate introduces her as his travel companion, and upon seeing her, you notice that she is a warrior with a lot of potential, and Mine comments to Fate that she found a place for them to camp, but he says that there is already a place for them to stay. And then he leaves her sleeping and goes back to training, and Aaron says that they should start with physical fighting, as this is the best way for him to learn to control his status. In this, Fate is impressed with the Lord, as he knows a lot, and Aaron explains that many warriors who became strong out of nowhere, they practice this. And then they get into position to fight, but you notice that Fate has the wrong posture and goes there to help him, and they start exchanging the first blows, and Aaron explains to him that Fate's body is very tense. And to exemplify what he means, Aaron strikes him quickly, and Fate is impressed with all that agility, in which he explains that the more he flexes, the weaker and slower his movement will be, because to inflict more damage on the body he must remain relaxed. Furthermore, Aaron explains that he being in this relaxed state, Fate is able to draw on his unconscious strength. Then the boy starts to attack him, and notices that his attacks become faster when he is not tense, but he suddenly begins to be dominated by gluttony, and you immediately notice that the color of his eyes has changed, and ask what's going on. But Fate can only think about attacking, and Aaron notices that the boy's movements have suddenly become faster, but Fate gives the excuse that he is a good teacher, to prevent him from knowing about gluttony. And well, Aaron attacks him again, but Fate manages to easily dodge the blows, and Greed comments that even though the boy is very hungry, he is able to move better. And at the end of the day, Aaron comments to Fate that in the next training session they will go for real combat practice, so he starts heading towards the inn, but on the way he smells a monster coming from the castle. And upon returning home, Aaron catches Mine eating all their food, and Fate apologizes, but the man says he will ask the villagers to share some more food with the two, and then Fate goes to the girl and says that it's all her fault. And meanwhile, the holy knight stops and observes the castle from afar, and Fate notices that there is a painting of Aaron on the wall next to his family, and Greed comments that Fate reminds him a lot of his son, and the two understand why he is a chief from a distant village. And meanwhile, Mine looks in the mirror, and sees several marks drawn on her face. And well, the next day Aaron gives him a stick, and asks the boy to defend himself just using it. But fate says that that tree branch won't be able to withstand any blow from the sacred sword. But the man says that he will succeed, because he is training with a good teacher, so he goes on the attack, and fate feels that he must predict the angle and trajectory of the sword, because that way he is able to reduce its rigidity at the right time, so that the impact of the sword is nullified. And with that he manages to defend the blow, and Aaron explains that he is now able to control his status, so Mine goes to him and draws a drawing on his face too, to get revenge for the previous night. And well, fate comments that she will leave the village the next day, and thanks her for all the stay that you provided them. As for Mine, she just continues commenting, and he apologizes for her, but Aaron says it's okay, and asks them to eat as much as they want, as they still have a lot of meat and vegetables. And Mine says everything tastes the same, because she no longer has a sense of taste, so Greed explains that this is what she pays for her anger, and the girl explains that there is still something she wants to do, and upon hearing this, the man understands her, and returns to observing the castle attentively. Then Fate asks if there is something with that castle, and the man explains that Hausen's domain was his castle 15 years ago, and he says that he had left Hausen by royal order, and in his absence his son had to face many monsters, to protect the village, and Aaron says that both the people and his family ended up falling into the hands of a crowned beast that had grown with the accumulated aggression. And since this happened, the Hausen domain belongs to the Genesis of Death, a Lich Lord, and his family is still trapped in the clutches of this being. And in the middle of the conversation Fate feels Gluttony attacking, and asks to go outside for a while. Then Aaron follows him and notices that he is planning to go to the castle, and so the man is willing to go with him, as this is a good opportunity for him to forget his past. As for Mine, she takes charge of watching the village in their absence, but she charges 50 gold coins, and well, they arrive at the castle entrance, and Fate kills his first enemy from a distance, and he explains that used a magic arrow with a petrifying effect caused by the sandstorm. Aaron comments that this technique is very difficult to manage, and because of that people stopped studying it in the capital, and he says he is surprised that Fate can use it with such perfection, but Greed enters the middle of the conversation, and says he is responsible for that. And well, they continue progressing and killing the monsters, until they finally enter the castle, and when going up to the second floor, they find Aaron's son playing the piano next to his mother, and upon seeing them, the Lord gets angry, excites, and his wife comments that she was eagerly awaiting his return home, so Aaron goes to the two of them and says he is relieved to see them well and alive, and upon hearing this, they find these words from their father strange, and say that he must be very tired, and Luke asks his father if he fulfilled the king's mission. Then Aaron says that the stampede has been resolved, and his son asks to know more details about the mission, and meanwhile Fate questions Greed about what is happening there, and he explains that those two may seem alive but they have been dead for a long time. For a long time, because what they are seeing is the result of an illusion spell. And well, Diana interrupts the conversation, and suggests that her husband go get some rest, and Luke asks if his father had brought him a gift, to which Aaron says yes, and when the man is distracted to get the gift, the boy tries to attack him. But Aaron defends himself and comments to his son that he has become very strong, and Luke says that he only became strong because he was forced. After all, he had to protect the castle in his father's absence, and this all over many years, because his father only cared about work and left his family with the monsters. And then the boy gets angry and says that he shouldn't be there after everything he did, and well, Fate tells Aaron that he can get rid of the illusions, and he asks Greed to release the black scythe, and he says that in fact, this weapon is capable of cutting the effects caused by an ability, but by doing so, the illusions will be defeated together, as all the souls that are devoured by gluttony will remain alive forever. And this is the equivalent of being confined in an endless hell, and without hope of salvation. And upon hearing this, Fate recoils, and feels that you shouldn't do this to Aaron's family, and the Lord says he will take care of it on his own, and in the meantime, Fate says he will take charge of looking for the Lich Lord. And when fighting Luke, Aaron notices that the boy has become very strong, and has kept all the teachings he taught alive, and well, Fate arrives in a room where there is the Lord sent everywhere, in which he uses his auto arrow guided to locate him. And Fate notices that all of the Lord's statistics are above 1,000,000. And then he remembers the training he had, and understands that the best thing to do is to control his tension and use the minimum amount of force necessary, and then he manages to attack the monster. But the Lord's ability to summon corpses remains intact, and all those souls begin to beg for salvation, so Fate feels guilty about attacking them, but greed warns him that there are some corpses behind him, and then Aaron appears to save him. And he explains that he only cut the tendons of the corpses, to immobilize them, and when looking at Diana, he remembers a memory from his family, where his wife asks him to stop taking so many risks, but he responds that there's no need to worry, after all, after he finishes off the monsters, he'll be right back. But that's not what happened, and Aaron says that if he had returned sooner, his family would still be alive, but he can at least find a way to end their suffering, separating them from the Lich Lord. Then he activates his ability Grand Cross, and begins to exorcise them, and when looking to the side, Fate sees Luke's sword, and then she picks it up and says that she will help Aaron exorcise the monsters, and so the two unite their swords and return with the Grand Cross even stronger. And with that, a beam of light takes over the castle, causing all the monsters to be eliminated. And after that, Aaron apologizes to his family for making them wait for so long, but their souls materialize, and Luke tells his father that he is not to blame for anything that happened. And Diana says that Aaron saved them in the end, but that's still not enough to take this burden off his shoulders, because for him, Aaron should never have left his family's side. After all, they were always more implants than order. And he apologizes to them again. However, Luke states that they are both fine now, and Diana asks Aaron to do what he thinks is right, and he says that he will live in a way that honors their memories, and as for the gift he had left to give for Luke, he finally gets to gift it. And with that they hug and the two begin to ascend to heaven along with all the other souls. But a mini curse that was left comes to them to interrupt the family's farewell, and Fate shoots him with an arrow, because that is a moment which must not be disturbed. And in doing so, he suffers again with gluttony but returns to normal soon afterwards, and well, all souls finally find their peace, and Aaron asks his family to wait for him, because as soon as he finishes whatever he has to do on Earth he will join them. And after leaving the castle, Fate notices that the man exceeded his level limit, and Aaron explains that this was most likely because he fought alongside Fate, so the boy wonders if this is really true, but the man says that they don't have time to waste, as there are still some monsters that need to be faced. And then the skeletons materialize, and Fate suggests that they have a competition of who kills the most monsters, and then they compete until daylight, and when they return, Mine says that they took too long, so Aaron gives the 50 gold coins that he had promised, and also apologizes for taking so long. And Fate calls her a mercenary, but Mine explains that she needs the money to rebuild the village, but the boy is suspicious of all this altruism, and she explains that money doesn't lie, and says that he will learn that with time. At this, Aaron tells her that he had the impression that he had already seen her, and now he is sure that he has already seen her, and he tells her that 50 years ago he saw her fighting some monsters that appeared in that village, and that's why she still has the same appearance as she did at the time, as Mine already had the image of a warrior at that time. And then she says that you have good eyes, and also says that if Aaron trains for a millennium, maybe he will reach her strength, at which he smiles and says that she evaluated him in a very strict way, but she says that she is just telling the truth, after all, humans have their limits. And Aaron questions what she could be, and the girl reveals that she is a ghost who is not allowed to leave, and she says that it is time for Fate to repay everything she has been doing for him. And well, you notice that Fate's eyes have suddenly returned to normal, and the boy explains that he has a condition in which he needs to kill monsters regularly, because if he doesn't, his eyes look like that. And then Aaron understands that this must be a great burden on his soul, and he asks the boy to return to his village after doing everything that needs to be done, as he has something very important to tell Fate. And meanwhile, Memel and Raphael talk about the philosopher's stone that he found, and it would be a stone capable of healing any illness or wound, and Memel says that immortality is finally in their hands, and well, one of the servants enters the room, and Raphael asks if anything important happened while they were away, as he didn't see Hato there. And you say that Hato was killed by a corpse, which, by the way, has already been discovered that he is actually a warrior, and not a monster, so Raphael wonders who this corpse would be. Fate notices her friend eating non-stop and wonders if she wouldn't have gluttony instead of anger, and she says that anger consumes a lot of calories, but she gives him her food and says she can share it too. And then she lies on his lap, and Fate wonders why she did that, and Mine explains that lying on the floor wouldn't be comfortable at all, and compared to his lap the place is more reasonable, and in a short time she's already is sleeping. And well, he remembers about her saying that she was a ghost, and that she was still looking to do something, and then she asks Greed what she is fighting against, but the sword remains silent, and Fate asks him to speak something. However, Greed says that if they continue traveling together he will begin to understand her, and upon hearing this, the boy begins to suspect that something is wrong in this story, and meanwhile, Miria asks Roxy how long it takes for them to get to Gaul, and she responds that they are already very close, and Mugan enters the conversation, and says that they will soon arrive in Hausen. And well, they finally arrive at the castle of the domain of Barbados, located in Hausen, and Roxy comments that Aaron used to live there, to which Miria asks who the current lord would be, and Roxy responds that now a crowned monster has taken his place, a known being as Lich Lord. And Miria comments that the castle is visibly finished, but Roxy says that she doesn't feel the presence of monsters coming from the place, and with that Mugan deduces that the area has been recently liberated. Well, Aaron appears there and welcomes everyone, and Mugan kneels down immediately, and says that it is an honor to meet the leader of the Barbados family, as it is one of the great families, and its leader is a master swordsman, called the Blade of Light. And well, Roxy apologizes for the sudden visit, but Aaron recognizes her, and the girl asks if he already knew her, in which you say you are an old acquaintance of Mason and Aisha, and they would have asked you to name the child who was born. And upon hearing this, Roxy is surprised, as her parents had never told her this story, and Mugan says she is jealous of her. After all, not everyone has a name given by a hero. However, Aaron corrects him, saying he is a former hero, and he comments that Roxy probably knows why he retired. In this case, he lost the motivation to fight because of losing his family. Then Roxy asks if he would have finished off the Lich Lord, and Aaron replies that he finished him off, but not alone, and then he remembers Fate, but he doesn't say anything to them, and Mugan comments that this warrior who helped him must be very strong, not only for fighting alongside a hero, but also for having helped defeat a crowned monster. And Miria says she wants to see this warrior, but Aaron says he has already left, and then Roxy asks to know the warrior's name, as she needs to report to the capital that the Lich Lord of Hausen has been defeated, but he apologizes, and he says he can't say the name of the warrior, because he himself requested confidentiality. Roxy understands the situation and apologizes for interfering in this matter, and well, Aaron asks if they would be going to Gaul, and she finds it strange that he knows that, but he explains that such a young holy knight coming to a place like that could only mean that. And in addition to knowing this detail, Aaron also knows that it was the Vleriks who sent her on this mission, but Roxy claims that she was only there of her own free will, but Aaron says that she was manipulated into wanting to go to Gaul, as she is Heart and his Barbados have always been a problem. And Roxy explains that she will still protect her people as she inherited the same desire from her father, and upon hearing this, the hero notices a funereal tone in her speech, and asks if Mason is gone, and the girl says yes. And Aaron asks if she would like to accept some guidance on what to do, as it will be a great help if he can teach her how to fight in Gaul. And Roxy shines her eyes at this proposal, and says that she didn't imagine such kindness, and then they start to fight, and Aaron notices that she absorbed Mason's teachings very well, and the girl says that she will do her best to get stronger and protect your people. And meanwhile, Fate and Mine find themselves in a strange place that looks like ruins, and the girl explains that she was born there but was soon taken to the imperial capital, so she has no memories of that place, but still remains an important place for her. And upon hearing this, Fate finds something strange, because Gaul collapsed 4,000 years ago, and well, she goes on and says that she found something. In this case, it was a giant cocoon, and Greed recognizes that thing, and Fate feels lost with everything. That situation, and asks what that cocoon would be. And Greed says it's a chimera. It's a biological weapon that the Gaul army tested in the past, and what they do is take a receptacle and sew monsters into it. However, Greed says they were all supposed to be inactive now. And Mind says that Fate will have to fight alongside her against these things, in order to repay all the help she gave. And well, he tries to analyze the status of Chimera Haniel, but notices that there is an error in the skills part. And Greed explains that the skills of many monsters were mixed in that cocoon, and this results in instability in the status of skills, and the girl pays attention to the fact that that cocoon is in a larval state, so they would be able to defeat it. However, Fate doesn't even know how to fight that thing, and Mine explains that as long as that being has a soul, they can damage his body at will, as he won't die at all. And Fate begins to understand things, and notices that you will need your gluttony to eat the monster's soul. And she confirms that that was exactly what she intended to do, and well, she opens a hole in the chimera, and inside it is possible to see a girl with white hair and red eyes, who stares back at them. Then a monster comes out of the cocoon, and Fate wonders why there is a person in the monster's chest, and when he looks better at her, he also notices that the girl has red eyes just like him. And Mine explains that the girl just was trying to intimidate him, so he should look away, otherwise Fate will be scared and unable to fight. And the boy questions who that woman could be, and Mine says that she is the core of the chimera, and that's why he should end it. The girl. Then Fate remembers that if he eats her soul, the girl will suffer forever in eternal torment, and so he refuses to do that. But Mine asks him not to be fooled by appearances, because that creature is just a monster that takes human form, and she says that if Fate is too naive, he will end up being killed by the monster. And well, the creature opens a crater in the ground with its magic, in which they are chased by lava, and Fate tells Greed that he needs the black scythe. But the sword explains that this magic attacks indirectly, and this causes damage with the lava, so it won't be able to cut through everything. And then Mine dispels the lava that was chasing them, and then begins to attack the chimera, in which Fate stays far away and uses his arrow with petrification magic, and when he sees that it works, the boy is all confident, but Greed the warning that it is not yet time to celebrate. In this case the petrification is undone and the creature's body regenerates. And Greed explains that the essence of a chimera is to fight without stopping, and with that Fate wonders how they will defeat such a creature. But upon observing Mine's attacks, he realized that they are getting stronger. And Greed says that the sloth will become heavier and more powerful as she uses it. However, it can compromise its agility by doing so, and well, the creature starts to scream in pain, and Mine explains that the chimera is going into a state of metamorphosis. Then a pair of wings are born on the creature, and she tells Fate to stay behind her, and upon seeing her taking this control, Fate remembers Roxy and also feels helpless for being protected again, because in this way he will be able to protect Roxy, and the boy feels tired of that. After all, he also wants to be the one with the power. And then he explains to Mine that he will be in a state of hunger, and she says that he must be careful with that, so as not to end up being completely consumed by gluttony, and he says that he knows that, but if that's not the case, it won't work to fight. And well, he manages to assume the half-state of hunger without losing control of his body, in which case the monster attacks feathers on them, and Fate decides to use them against the monster himself, and then he positions himself in a perfect place for the attack, and says he will throw the sandstorm along with the feathers. But to do so, Fate asks Greed to provide him with the bloody Legopod attack. He then petrifies the feathers and the creature, and Mine activates her laziness to attack him, and upon seeing the girl's performance, Fate becomes distracted, but Greed calls him an idiot and says he shouldn't be wasting time impressing himself. And then the creature creates a barrier around its body, and Fate notices that he will need his black scythe to get around the situation. But when attacking the barrier, the black scythe cannot cut it. So Greed explains that Fate needs to visualize the monster's mana flow, and aim at the weakest part. And he does so, but the creature manages to escape, and even now he is at his limit to continue fighting, and seeing this, Mine decides to give him a ride to the enemy, and then she throws him towards the chimera, and in the air he wonders how he will end the creature, in which Greed tells him gives good news, and says that he is now able to use his level 2 secret technique. But Greed asks for 20% status. and Fate accepts immediately. And then he aims again at the weakest point of the enemy's mana. But when he gets closer, Chimera traps him in the barrier, and Greed says that the enemy's idea is to burn himself with him. But Fate says that all he has to do is eat the soul of the monster before being burned. In this he attacks the creature with the Deadly Hell ability, and thus he manages to hit the Chimera, and then his telepathy ability is automatically activated, and he is able to see several silhouettes of people, including that of the girl in the nucleus. And after defeating him, Fate feels a certain pain in his heart, as if he was sad for having done that, and Greed explains that he just ate something similar, so it's normal for him not to feel happy. And well, mind goes to the monster's wreckage, and Fate asks if she knew that girl, and she replies that she forgot what happened in the past, but if something became a chimera, the only thing left is to defeat it, otherwise more people will die. And when analyzing what lack of control is capable of doing, Fate asks Mind to kill him if he loses control due to gluttony, and he explains that she is the only person capable of stopping him in this state. Then she hugs him and accepts his request, and well, at the end of the afternoon Fate says that she will go to Babylon, and Mind says that she will stay there, to build the village that she had promised to build for them, and she says that she has the feeling that he will die before they even see each other again, as she remembers when he decided to unlock a new level while being in that location. And in addition, he also had his own status left to give to Greed. In this she leaves him behind, and Fate asks her to stay with him until he regains his status, and well, he leaves for Babylon, a city known as the Protective City, and he explains that the walls made of alloy made of adamantine, they are very resistant, and that is why they have lasted for millennia, even with the various attacks from Gallian monsters. Well, Greed explains that he should follow the North Gate, to gain access to Babylon, and seeing that he understands a lot about the place, Fate asks if he has already been there, and Greed says that its former bearer has already taken him to that city. And then Fate understands that this guy certainly had some ability from the deadly sins, due to being able to carry Greed. And the sword says yes, but this warrior ended up dying and leaving him behind, and Greed comments that humans are mortal, so they end up dying eventually, while he is just a sword, and that's why he lives forever. However, Greed says that this is not so good either, as he always has to say goodbye to his companions. And upon hearing this, Fate shows surprise, as he didn't know that Greed was immortal, and then he explains that because it is one of the weapons of the deadly sins, it cannot be destroyed. And well, as they continue further, they finally see the North Gate of Babylon, and arriving in the city, Fate tries to buy a meat skewer, to satisfy his gluttony, but the item costs 5 times more expensive than in the capital, and Greed explains that everything is more expensive there, because of the work involved in bringing things there. Well, a holy knight asks everyone to make way, because the new lord of Babylon is arriving from the capital, and when the lord arrives, Fate discovers that it is Roxy, and in the middle of the crowd, a woman whispers that Roxy will die in that local. Fate explains that a huge variety of warriors gather in Babylon, both mercenaries well trained in combat and former holy knights and people against the current holy knights. And Greed explains that in Babylon, if you are very strong, your failures are forgiven, and Fate understands that they do this because they need as much help as possible to deal with the monsters, so that would be the perfect place for him. And well, a holy knight introduces himself as Northern Alistair, and says it is an honor to be able to serve the heiress of one of the 5 great families, and seeing him all helpful, Roxy notes that after the death of his father, Alistair was responsible for the security of Babylon. However, he still shows dissatisfaction at not having been able to save her father even though she had served alongside him, which Roxy is impressed by, as she did not know that Alistair was at her father's side when he died. And although he shows regret for not having been strong, Roxy tells him to raise his head, and she informs him that she is there to follow in her father's footsteps, defending Gallia and her people from the incursion of monsters, in which the two join hands. Then Miria notices that Alistair is looking at Roxy a lot, and she feels that her friend's chastity is in danger, and so she tries to go there and cause trouble, but Mugan restrains her, and explains that if she gets involved with a holy knight, you will end up losing your head. And meanwhile, Fate walks around the city complaining about the abusive price of things, until Greed draws his attention to a scabbard, and shows that he really liked it. But Fate notes that this scabbard must be absurd right away. Then Greed tells him to stop being stingy. After all, he can always go hunting monsters to make more money. And well, the store's merchant notices Fate standing in front of his establishment, and offers to serve him. But he notices that the boy's cape is burned, but it appears to have been burned by something much hotter than normal. And then Greed feels that he can trust that guy, as he has a very attentive eye for detail. So he pressures Fate to buy what he wants, but when asking the price of the scabbard, the merchant responds that it is just an exhibition, and says he can make a sheath that best matches your weapon. And when analyzing the sword, he is surprised, and comments that he had never seen a sword as incredible as that, and obviously Greed boasts about it, saying that that guy understands what he's talking about. And the merchant says that to build a sheath that matches that sword, he will charge 500 gold coins, and upon hearing this, Fate gets scared and leaves this story aside, as he believes that charging 500 gold coins is a robbery. Furthermore, the prices of things in Babylon are already high, so they couldn't spend money on a simple scabbard. And while he finds himself thinking about this, a group of warriors appears, and calls him to ally with them, and the gang leader comments that Fate is certainly looking to stand out so he can work as a volunteer soldier in the capital. But upon hearing the proposal, he refuses, and says that he doesn't work in groups with anyone. And then the man analyzes his clothes and deduces that he would be a former knight, so he apologizes and goes on his way. And as for Fate, he comes back to hunt more monsters, and on the way Greed explains that when they cross the border they arrive in Gallia, and Fate just comments on the unbearable smell that the place exudes. And then Greed informs him that the spores that the mosses exude are slightly toxic, so he should avoid breathing them, because the moss could grow in his lungs. However, Greed tries to reassure him, and says that things in Gallia they are just like that. And further ahead, a group of approximately 50 orcs start running towards them, and Greed explains that these creatures have a certain intelligence, so they will attack you in a coordinated way. Then Fate draws his sword and goes up, but more warriors appear and lead the attack before him, and Greed tells Fate to hurry, because if he doesn't kill the monsters he won't have enough money to take the scabbard. And although stealing kills is immoral, Greed states that there is no etiquette or rules when hunting monsters, and then Fate notices that there are 2 more waves of orcs arriving, and with that he feels that he will no longer be stealing kills if he fights alongside the warriors. After all, now they will also need help. And Greed says that this is a great chance for Fate to act as a hero as he likes, so he attacks the monsters and unlocks the 3rd level of his sword, which provides him with a total block of physical and magical attacks. And then he wonders what to do now, and Greed just tells him to attack, because that shield is useful for more things than he imagines. And when going through the monsters, Fate notices that that shield is really incredible. And Greed explains that what he did is called study attack, and it only requires him to use a little strength, and that Fate has plenty of it. And after defeating countless orcs, he realizes that his gluttony skill is still not working. And Greed asks if this has been happening since he defeated K1LL, and Fate says yes, and deduces that perhaps this is a result of controlling his abilities, as Aaron had said. And well, he decides to just cut off the orc's ears and return to the city. And when he gets there, everyone looks at him with great surprise, as Fate alone hunted the equivalent of 2 entire companies. However, when placing the items on the table, one of the warriors who was in the fight complains and says that Fate stole his group's fangs, so he tries to take the boy's merchandise claiming to be his. But Fate holds his arm and tells him to back off while they have time, and upon hearing such outrage, the guy resists, but Fate twists his arm, and the other members of the group go at it, but end up being knocked down too. And finally, he finishes the leader with a kick in that place, in which the girl returns with 100 gold coins, to pay for the orc's ears, and then Roxy goes to the place of confusion to scold Fate, but he explains the entire situation, and she understands that he acted only in self-defense. And even though she thought he overreacted, Roxy feels partially responsible for the degradation of order in Babylon, as she did nothing while the Holy Knight responsible for Babylon's security was away. Then Fate realizes what she was talking about of her father, and Roxy explains that given all this context, he will not be punished, and as for the other warriors, she says that she will turn a blind eye this time, so they will only have to spend 1 day in prison. And upon seeing her so close, Fate remembers that he needed to look up to see her, and then he feels that he has grown a lot in recent times, and Roxy catches his attention, and asks if he was paying attention to what she was doing, saying, and to avoid complications Fate says he was paying attention. However, Miria says that he wasn't there, and in addition she tells him to take off that mask when talking to Roxy, and Mugan explains that a warrior's mask is part of his identity, so she shouldn't make him take it off. And Roxy asks to know his name, but he only says his nickname, which in this case is Corpse, and Roxy agrees to call him that, and asks the boy not to cause any more trouble around the city, and before leaving, she advises him to take better care of his appearance, as he dresses in a somewhat disturbing and sinister way. And upon hearing this, he almost has a fit and runs away, and Mugan shows interest in knowing more about what kind of warrior he would be, because if he was able to defeat all those warriors, he is certainly a very strong guy. And meanwhile, Fate regrets what Roxy had said about him, but Greed says that her having that impression of him is better than discovering his real identity, and he explains that if he continues with this mask that changes perception, no one will find out who he is. And Greed goes back to talking about him having to look after appearances, and suggests that Fate start this by buying him a scabbard, but he goes back to saying that they need a lot more money to buy the scabbard. And speaking of which, that merchant will talk to him, and comments about Fate having defeated several warriors at the exchange center, and he says that he would love to see him fight with his equipment, but before that he introduces himself as Jade Stratos. And upon entering his workplace, Fate understands that the man wants to promote his products through him, and Jade explains that they have been looking for an ideal warrior so that they can form a fruitful partnership for both sides. And then he asks if Fate would like to be this warrior, so he accepts the offer immediately, and receives a new outfit for 80 gold coins, but as they are partnering, Jade offers him the same outfit for half the price. And after that, Fate feels his stomach growl, and notices a very busy tavern right in front of him, and entering the place, he immediately understands why the place is so crowded, but when looking at that girl back, he feels unable to look away. And then the girl goes to him and recognizes him even with Fate wearing the mask, and she explains that they are both the same, in which he realizes that she also has a deadly sin ability. And she introduces herself as Heiress of Lust, and then they are alone, and the girl tells him to take off the mask. After all, the alteration of perception doesn't work on her. Besides, Eris shows interest in seeing him better. However, he becomes uncomfortable again when looking at her directly, and the girl explains that this is a side effect of the lust ability, which consists of emitting an uncontrollable charm to whoever looks at her, and this applies to everyone, regardless of age or gender. And well, Fate questions about she said she was waiting for him, and Eris explains that she has been watching him for a long time, since the time he was in the capital, and she reveals that she has been thinking about making contact with him since her gluttony ability was awakened. However, she decided to wait until he found Greed, so he deduces that because she knows about his sword, she must also know about mine, and she says that she doesn't talk much to people from the first generation, as she is part of the second. And by the way, she and mine don't get along so well, but Eris also believes that the girl doesn't like her because her breasts are bigger, and since they touched on that subject, Eris thanks him for Fate killing Haniel because that saved him work. And then he deduces that she knows practically everything, but she confesses that she still doesn't know who took the cocoon to the place where Fate found it, and Greed informs him that all the chimeras come from the capital of Gallia, and Eris says that there must still be a few more chimeras developing. And taking into account that the class of Holy Knights has been weakening, she believes that it will be difficult to hunt these new chimeras, and well, Eris decides to change the subject to talk about her real objective with that conversation. And she explains that in addition to having the ability of capital sin, she also has another identity. In this case, she would be a guardian of the kingdom, and because of this she puts the affairs of the kingdom above the affairs of any individual, therefore she is working to a better future. And Eris comments that if something causes a big loss today but in the future rewards the kingdom, she will support it. At this, Fate asks her where she is going with this conversation, and she just says Roxy's name, and meanwhile, Alistair explains to her that there is a small stampede in eastern Gallia, and Roxy proposes to deal with this danger immediately. And Eris reveals to Fate that she will die in Gallia, and upon hearing this he gets stressed, and questions whether she wants Roxy to die, and she questions whether he knows how the phenomenon of aggression works. And Fate understands that she is just wanting to change the subject, but Eris says that this has everything to do with the conversation, and she explains that after a monster is killed, its aggressiveness remains, and over the years it accumulates little by little until it gives rise to a crowned beast. And she reveals that this same phenomenon can occur with humans, so her idea is to take all the oppression, discrimination and misery caused by the Holy Knights, and add that to the death of the only Holy Knight loved by the masses, that is, Roxy. And then the wave of aggression generated by his premature death will swallow the rest that has been slowly accumulating, and thus it will give rise to a human with a totally new type of power, and this new being will be responsible for being the pillar of kingdom. And after explaining her entire plan, she explains that Roxy's death will guide that kingdom in a better direction, but Fate disputes this, and says that her death should not be honored in that way. And he explains that none of the Holy Knights care about people as much as she does, so her death wouldn't bring anything good to anyone, and he leaves the room upset, but Eris states that the plan is already underway, and he won't be able to stop it. And then Fate sets out to fight anyone behind this scheme, and meanwhile Roxy makes her way to Gallia, and Fate promises to protect her at any cost. Northern reports that they lost contact with a group that was sent to Gallia to collect raw materials, and then Roxy questions what would have caused this, and he says he doesn't know, so she asks where the group would be going, and he replies that they were going to the Great Ravine. And upon hearing this, Roxy hurries her partners to go to Gallia to save them immediately, and meanwhile, Jade tells Fate that he will need magic crystal to make the ideal scabbard for his sword, but he informs her that they have been very difficult to find this item. And then Fate wonders if there isn't a shipment arriving, and Jade explains that the royal army oversees the supply of magic crystal, so he doesn't know anything about it, and Greed suggests that they go hunting for this item on their own. Then Fate asks where he could find magic crystal, and Jade says that there are some in Gallia, and so the boy is willing to go there to look for the item, and upon hearing this, the merchant is surprised, and promises to give him a discount for that. And then he shows her a map from his master, an ancient warrior in his youth who used this map to collect materials, and Jade explains that the points that are marked are far to the south, near the Great Ravine. Greed then agitates his partner, so they can go after this item and get its scabbard straight away, and on the way they come across several monsters, and to attack them, Fate combines using shield charge with Greed. And with that, he attacks the enemies, knocking them down one by one, and meanwhile, Roxy's group is having difficulties, as they are in a place where the compasses don't work correctly, and then Miria questions how they will find the way to the Great Ravine like this. And Mugan explains that the normal thing would be for them to navigate based on the position of the moon and stars, but with those clouds in the sky it will be impossible to do that, and then Miria gets frustrated and starts cursing the clouds. But unlike her, Roxy remains calm and explains that there is a way to identify the approximate location of Gallia. They just need to analyze whether a certain location has a dense population of orcs, as records say that the largest patches of orcs are more located to the south. And upon hearing this, Mugan understands that if they follow the orcs' trail, they will be taken towards the Great Ravine. But Roxy explains that there are other monsters in Gallia besides orcs, such as the crowned beasts, so they need to be careful as they move forward. And well, Greed tells Fate that he's starting to look like a warrior, because a warrior always needs to be relaxed before a battle, and Fate just tells him to be quiet and goes back to focusing on silence. Until he comes across a strange, all-white place, and when he looks ahead, he is able to see that girl he defeated that day, and she tries to say something to him, but the interference in their communication makes it impossible for Fate to listen to her. And when he looks down, he notices that his feet are submerged in a red and viscous liquid. In addition, the calm scene from before has changed to a war scene, with several dead monsters. And then he is caught by two dead people, one of them being the Hato that he himself killed, and they pull him under that red substance, in which he wakes up from that horrible nightmare, and Fate feels the presence of a monster, but Greed explains that they are not ordinary monsters. In this case they are beasts crowned, and there are more than one. However, Fate cannot see them, so Greed advises him to use his night vision, and when he does so, he sees 4 salamanders, and then Greed tells him to switch to the black bow, so they can make the first attack with petrifying magic. But when attacking them, Fate notices that there is something strange happening with these monsters. In this case, salamanders tend to instinctively flee when they are injured, but instead they are not running away, but they are also not trying to retaliate the attacks. And Greed feels that they may be being controlled by some other being, and so he suggests following them, to see where they are going, and well, Roxy and her group are attacked by some salamanders, and in the middle of the fight Roxy misses from Northern, and asks where he is. And he appears all injured, and explains that he was crushed by the monsters, so Miria uses her magic sword to attack them. But her power doesn't work against those beings, and upon seeing her on the ground, Roxy goes to her to tell her to help. But a salamander attacks the two, but the corpse appears to save them, and then other salamanders attack, and Fate uses his sharp blade to attack the monsters. Mugan is impressed by this, as that boy has a lot of power in his attacks even when using a simple sharp blade, and after the confrontation, Roxy thanks the corpse for helping them, and she informs him that thanks to him, fewer soldiers were killed. And as for Miria, she maintains her tough pose and refuses to thank her for the help. What's more, she reveals that she wanted to be Roxy's savior. Basically her tantrum is just envy. And Mugan catches her attention, and introduces himself again as the captain of that unit, and as for that idiot, he introduces her as Miria, and tells her to thank the corpse soon. And then Roxy introduces Northern, a holy knight assigned to Babylon, and he thanks him too. But Corpse says they don't need to thank him, as there is something else that worries him and makes him there. And meanwhile, Roxy notices that there is an emblem on one of the salamanders, and Mugan confirms that this same emblem is on the other salamanders too, which Miria becomes suspicious of, and what's more, Mugan explains that crowned beasts don't usually work together. And Miria reports that these monsters acted as if they were after Roxy, but she says that this is just a coincidence, and then Northern states that they cannot be sure what will happen in Gallia when they get there, especially when the divine dragon resolves to appear. And well, they finally make it to the Great Ravine, and Mugan says he's happy that they're heading in the same direction as the corpse, but Miria warns them that they need to hurry to rescue the supply unit. There Roxy reaches out to him, and Greed notices that Fate doesn't want telepathy to be activated, and then Miria pushes his hand, and says that he shouldn't think too much of himself just because he's a little strong, because for her he was a pest that should go away soon. And upon hearing this, Roxy apologizes again for the girl, and Corpse says goodbye to them, and as usual, Greed hates him, as Fate was called a pest by the girl. And well, they continue their journey and arrive at a place with clean air, and Greed explains that that air purification must be a side effect of an ancient battle, and walking a little further they find a petrified monster, and around there are several other monsters in the same state. However, when looking at a specific being he sees himself petrified too, but he soon realizes that it was just a hallucination, and then he remembers that Jade had said about magical crystals being transparent and colorless, but with a slight purple glow. And as he continues further, Fate finds Eris, and then he begins to follow her, but quickly loses sight of her, so Greed tells him to look at that being in front of him, and as he does so, he comes across a chimera, which it is possibly a prototype, as there is no core in it. And Greed suggests that that chimera was possibly buried there in some ancient battle, and due to a landslide its head ended up being unearthed, leaving the specimen. And when going down there, Fate finds some more evidence of a landslide, but unlike this chimera, apparently these others that were also buried managed to awaken, and Fate notices that there were 3 that escaped, and then he wonders if Eris is behind it. Of it all. Then a bang occurs in the east, that is, the same direction that Roxy was looking for, and Fate rushes to save her again, while Greed, he just regrets that they are not having time to look for the magic crystal. And meanwhile Miria stands in front of Roxy, to protect her, but a confrontation begins and everyone is taken to the ground, but the corpse appears once again to save them, and then he attacks them with his magic bow, and asks if everyone is okay. Roxy then informs that Mugan and Northern were injured, and as for the Chimera's injuries, they are slowly regenerating, and Greed comments that this regeneration is very weak, and doesn't even compare to Haniel's. And Fate explains to everyone that those beings are called Chimera, and their cores are their weakness, and in those same cores there is a monster embedded in the middle, causing the Chimera to always keep moving. And Fate explains to Roxy that they just need to finish off the core monster, but when they go on the attack, the monsters set the place on fire, to try to keep them away, but the warriors are resistant to fire and keep heading towards them. And seeing that that wasn't enough to drive them away, the Chimera protects its core by covering it. But Fate hits the monster, and opens the way for Roxy to reach the core. And as for Miria, she uses the Flame of Flamberge power of her magic sword to deflect the Chimera's flames, and with that Greed understands that even though she is an arrogant mouthy girl, she has the talent to fight. And then Fate goes to her to save her, and Miria feels useless for having been saved again by that boy, so she goes to Mugan to check on him, and Roxy tells the girl to take everyone to a safe place. Meanwhile, she and the corpse will take care of the remaining chimeras. And then they use the same method from before to finish off the other chimeras, and meanwhile Fate realizes that this is the first time he is fighting alongside Roxy, and he feels that fighting with her feels more natural than with Mine and Aaron. And well, there was only one chimera left for them to finish them all off, but Fate notices that Roxy appears to be a little out of breath, and she says she can still fight, so the chimera jumps, and Corpse agrees to kill them when the monster lands. But when the chimera lands, the whole floor crumbles, and the two are sucked into the abyss, where Fate catches Roxy and explains that she has a resistant body, so they won't die from the fall. And after that, he wakes up, and when he looks up, Fate sees a hole that reflects the light outside, but he realizes that the mask has fallen from his face, and Roxy briefly whispers the corpse's real name. And then she suddenly gets up, but Fate manages to put the mask on in time, and well, he uses a fireball to light up the place, and explains that if the floor hadn't collapsed, they would certainly have killed the chimera. And upon hearing this name, Roxy shows that she doesn't know what he's talking about, and he tells her that these beings are apparently artificial monsters created in Gallia 4,000 years ago. And then he changes the subject, and asks if she managed to find the unit of supply. And she, with great sadness, reveals that when they arrived at the location, the advanced base, along with the entire unit, had already been killed, in which she shows curiosity in knowing how the corpse found out about the chimera. And he explains that a surviving Gallian told him, and Roxy deduces that this survivor is a young girl with a giant axe, and she reports that she has already seen her in her territory. In addition, Roxy has also heard rumors about this girl going to Babylon, accompanied by a young man wearing a skull mask. Then he is discovered, and reveals that he was her companion. But he asks Roxy not to look at him like that, but she explains that his appearance reminds her of an acquaintance who is in the capital. And although this person is far away, she feels as if he is with her at this very moment, and she comments that she is not sure if she did the right thing by leaving him in the capital, as she is unsure if he is really happy with this. And then the corpse says that he must be, after all, having someone so worried about him would certainly make him very happy. And suddenly his gluttony starts to attack, and he asks Roxy not to look into his eyes. Then he runs away and smells a monster nearby, and then the chimera shows up, but Fate finishes it without much trouble, and he notices that that chimera has that same emblem as the salamanders. And with that, Greed states that there is indeed someone controlling these monsters to kill Roxy, and Fate remembers Eris saying that she would be killed in Gallia, and then he promises revenge against Eris. Then Roxy goes there, but Fate reassures her, and says that she has already taken care of the monster, and well, the ceiling starts to collapse, and they see several magical crystals, but Fate comments that this is just a fossilized monster. And Roxy explains that magic crystals are found inside these types of monsters, and so he is surprised to learn this information, and after that they finally return to the surface, and Miria hugs her warmly, and says she is happy that Roxy is okay. And she, in turn, states that she is also happy to see them all well. And that night, an unknown blonde man with a skull mask walks under the full moon. A circle closes around Fate, and Roxy challenges him to a fair duel, and when faced with this out of nowhere, he wonders if he did something wrong, so Miria comes to him with a list, which contains all the violent acts he has done, and she says she is amazed at how he could have done all this in such a short time. After all, it has only been a month since they returned from the Great Ravine. And Fate says that every time he needed to use violence, it was because his enemies came to him and not the other way around. However, Roxy states that she will no longer be able to tolerate his violent acts, even if he is innocent. Then he questions what she wants him to do, and she suggests that he join the royal army, because if he does that, not even the most troublesome warriors will be able to do anything against him, and then Fate refuses the offer, and says no, intends to affiliate with Nowhere, and Greed adds, saying that they need to have their freedom. At this, Roxy says that she already expected this response from him, and she informs him that if he is going to refuse, he needs to be prepared to reflect on his actions in a cell, and Fate says that he would like to be spared that, but since he has no choice, he draws his sword with the sheath, and Roxy says she won't be responsible if his sword breaks. And having said that, the two begin the duel, and Fate immediately notices that he is unable to contain her, even though he has an advantage in their status, and he understands that that is a type of strength that can only be acquired with daily training. And then she manages to catch him distracted, and damages a part of his mask, and Roxy makes it clear that if he doesn't take that fight seriously, his identity will be exposed to everyone. And when he attacks him again, Fate just dodges, and she explains that he won't achieve anything if he just keeps dodging, and then he decides to take the fight seriously, and reveals his sacred sword technique, which Roxy questions how he manages to use this even without having the appropriate sword. And he explains that his scabbard is special, and in addition, that technique was actually a weapon complement that improves the sacred sword technique, and all this thanks to his scabbard made from the magic crystal he picked up in the Great Ravine. And upon seeing the skill he has in wielding the sword, she asks if he would be a former holy knight, and he replies no, because he is just a warrior, and when he goes at it, his strength is visibly disproportionate to Roxy. Then Miria begins to panic, and begs her not to lose the fight, and meanwhile, Fate keeps traveling in Roxy's necklace, and upon analyzing better what it is made of, he notices that the material is from that same stone and before. And then she takes advantage of his gap to win the fight, whereupon Greed is thrown away and calls him an idiot, and after beating him, Miria returns with her arrogance, and says that there would be no way for her goddess to lose to that skull. And Roxy asks why he let his guard down, and he just acts like he doesn't understand and says he has no idea what she's talking about, and Roxy comments on his swordsmanship, and asks if he learned to fight with Eren because how she was instructed by him. Roxy is able to notice a similarity in the way Fate fights with his. And then she remembers what Eren said, that he had met a traveler who by the way was heading towards Gallia, and upon seeing him he decided to take up the sword once again, and Roxy reveals that Eren had had difficulties fighting a certain traveler. And she says that if that traveler is him, she would like to ask for something, but before she says what it would be, Fate says that if he is that traveler, that would be his problem, and he suggests that Roxy just focus on protecting herself in Gallia. And after that, he turns his back and leaves, and then Fate notices that Roxy is always very kind, because even though a great threat is approaching in her life, she was still worried about him, and well, Mugan goes to him and says that he had an excellent performance in the fight, considering that he was fighting Roxy. And upon seeing this, he says he understands why he was able to kill a chimera, but Fate says that those creatures were being controlled by someone else. After all, the salamanders had the same emblem, and he goes back to saying that this is Eris's doing. And Mugan reports that he checked the creature and says that the person had an excellent idea in using a monster in the core, and Fate says he is surprised that he realized this just by looking at the chimera, and Mugan explains that his family studied about the creature Gallian technology that has been lost for generations. Furthermore, he informs that his daughter is also talented and studious, just like her late father, and Fate comments that the chimeras are artificial monsters made with Gallian technology, and then he suggests that Mugan ask his daughter to take a look in that. However, he interprets this request as if Fate wanted to be introduced to his daughter, but the boy tries to calm him down, and explains that he didn't want to say anything like that, and meanwhile, a friend of Rain asks if she has heard about Rafali, and says no, and her friend comments that there are rumors about him having locked himself in his room to study the Philosopher's Stone. At this, Rain expresses surprise at discovering this, and her friend says that he got his hands on the stone in Tenburn, as he had been on a research trip there before Hato died, and upon opening a book about the Philosopher's Stone, Rain discovers that it can possibly heal any wound, in addition to being able to impart great strength to its owner. But in exchange for all this, the philosopher's stone dominates the owner's mind and body, and upon hearing this, her friend asks what Rain thinks Raffaele is planning, and she says she doesn't know yet. And meanwhile Fate has a memory with Mime, and she talked about the divine dragon being in a place called E's domain, and she also informs him that if he tries too hard in combat, the dragon's abilities will overwhelm him, and will make him lose control. Then an alarm starts ringing, and Northern goes to Roxy to inform her that there is a massive stampede in progress, and then she says that they must intercept them, to protect Gallia, and upon hearing all this noise, Fate heads there too. And he sees all that stampede heading towards Roxy's group. So Greed asks if he's going to try to act like a hero again, and Fate says that there's no need, because if that group is just a death march, she'll be able to handle it. Of the message. However, when he sees the monsters, he goes into a state of half-starvation but manages to control it, and then Fate says that they must leave at any moment, to discover what caused all this, but Greed claims that he already knows what caused this, and he informs that something is approaching the royal army, coming from the east, but when looking in that direction, Fate can't see anything. However, soon after, he notices that the enemy is moving along the ground, and Fate states that if they continue like this, they will quickly reach the royal army, and Greed says that both Roxy and the others are focused on the death march, so if they are caught off guard, the attack will hit them squarely. And then Fate arms himself with his bow, and comments that he can use gluttony to amplify the charged shot and have double the range, but this is a modified technique, capable of being used only in a state of half-hunger, and the name of the technique is Charged Shot Spiral. And by shooting the arrow at the monsters, Greed notices that he has increased the range and penetration of the attack, and Fate explains that he cannot always rely on secret techniques, as they cost him a lot. And well, the monster finally rises to the surface, and upon seeing it, they notice that the creature has the same emblem as the salamanders, so Fate jumps to the creature, and on the way he comments to Greed that his self before, I would never have thought about jumping from such a high place. And as he gets closer to the creature, he discovers that it is a crowned beast, whose resistance, mana and motivation exceed 10 million, and Greed states that even a holy knight would not be a match for this monster, and so he asks Fate to switch to the magic shield. And then, the monster throws a rain of acid on them, mixed with corrosion magic, so Fate understands that this creature possibly used this combination to dissolve the soil and be able to swim. And Greed states that if that substance touches his skin, Fate will be dead. And then he deduces that he won't be able to fight up close, so he asks Greed to take his 10%, so they can add fire magic to the attack. And when he attacks the monster, it suddenly disappears, but appears on top of him to try to attack him, and Greed explains that the monster just separated itself to continue the attack, so the creature would be able to survive on their magic. Then they notice another monster heading towards the royal army, but when Fate tries to stop him, 3 other monsters stop him, and he attacks them with Grand Cross, but they disappear again, and Greed deduces that the monsters had actually prepared an ambush for Fate. And then he states that this is not something a monster would do, and to stop them from proceeding, Fate positions himself at the monster's exit point, and plans to aim at its core, to kill it, so he jumps into the crack and asks Greed to take another 20%. And with that, he obtains the ability, Bloody Ptarmigan Charged Shot Spiral, and upon encountering this, Greed questions whether Fate really intends to make him use this power, and he explains that this power will reach the core ignoring the other pieces of the creature, as Greed will be able to control the magic. But when the creature receives the attack, it fires something first, and Fate notices that even though he took the monster's soul, he is still alive somehow, and when he looks up, he notices a blonde man with a similar skull mask. In this Fate believes that that person is Eris copying him, and when he goes up, Greed notices that that being has a weapon of capital sin, in his case it is the black pistol sword, the weapon of envy, and taking this into consideration, Greed states that it is I'm almost certain that Eris is involved in this. And upon approaching the boy, the monsters return, and Greed explains that the power released by the monsters previously was actually some kind of magic bullet that extracts latent power, and for this reason the monsters remain alive even without the nucleus, after although the nucleus itself became capable of dividing and fleeing. And Greed states that an enemy capable of infinite replication is a bad match for Fate, so the monsters lie down on him, and he just holds his breath and uses Omega Slime's corrosion magic to get past them. And then Fate stops next to that masked being who he believes to be Eris, and says that the slimes will not be a match for him now. But his gluttony tightens again, and Greed explains that if his stats increase too quickly, his ability can out of control. Therefore he must control himself. But Fate states that before that happens, he will defeat Eris. But when he attacks her, a shield inhibits his arrow. And when looking at his status, Fate notes that he has already reached his maximum potential as a human, and Greed informs him that he needs to reach an inhuman level, i.e. the E domain, otherwise he won't be able to go any further than that. And then Fate understands that her attack was repelled because Eris had already entered the E domain, and people who conquer this are immune to attacks from anyone else. But Fate tries to attack her anyway, and that being says that he is just wasting his time. And upon hearing that voice, he discovers that the masked person was not Eris, as he thought, so he is thrown back and the guy starts shooting at Fate from afar, and then he feels that his enemy is very strong like that time. However, he claims that he is ready to kill and also to die. Then the guy stops in front of him and threatens to kill him now. And to avoid death, Fate lets the power of gluttony take over his body. But in doing so, he reaches the domain of E, and then he thanks that masked man, for if it weren't for him, he wouldn't have reached this level of power. Then the two continue the fight, and Fate notices that he is now able to see the shots clearly. Then he uses his sword to create a smoke screen, and then cuts the guy's mask while he was distracted. And when he does this, he discovers that that person was actually Northern, and so he takes a flute and starts playing it, and a divine dragon appears heading west, that is, in the same direction as Roxy. And Northern claims that the dragon will get there in 30 seconds, Fate tries to hurry but is attacked by it, and in addition to Northern, he is also surprised by a barrier of slimes, and Greed says that his plan is simply to buy time, prevented Fate from reaching Roxy. And meanwhile, the divine dragon arrives at its destination, and everyone starts to retreat, but Roxy asks for her father's strength to be able to finish off that divine creature, but the dragon tries to attack her, but Fate manages to arrive in time, and saves her once again. Then the dragon attacks with the same power, and again he protects her with his shield, but his mask is completely destroyed, and Roxy finally discovers that the corpse was actually Fate all along, and upon seeing that he was discovered, he stands in front of her without the mask, after a long time. And this was another video on the channel. If you liked it and want more videos like this, subscribe and leave a like. See you in the next one.